So you didn't miss the full disclosure. My school has received money from Facebook for the News Integrity Initiative and scholarships and such. I'm going to propose that we start with some introductions from the panelists, just for who they are. I'll get things going, then stand back and we'll get to the discussion. Meredith, why don't you start?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jeff. My name is Meredith Clark. I'm an associate professor at Northeastern University in Boston. I'm also the founding director of the Center for Communication, Media Innovation, and Social Change.
Jacqueline?
Hello, my name is Jacqueline Mason. I'm Director of Programs at Media Democracy Fund and Director of the Disinfo Defense League, which is a network of organizations working on disinformation, which affects communities of color.
Mike?
I'm Mike Masnick, the founder and editor of TechDirt, which writes about all this kind of stuff, and also the founder of the Copia Institute, which is a think tank that produces reports and events on all sorts of issues related to policy and technology.
And Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Barrett. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Business and Human Rights at NYU's Stern School of Business. And before I came to the center in 2017, I was a journalist for more than 30 years at the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg Businessweek magazine.
So I want to start with two examples from recent coverage. The Wall Street Journal, within 3 days, had a Peggy Noonan column suggesting, after having gone to a Chatham House Rule event, so we don't know where it was or who she was speaking with, that scared her to death about online and children, and proposed the idea that people under 18 should be forbidden from social media and YouTube. Good luck with that, Peggy. 3 days later, Crispin Sartwell, a Dickinson professor, wrote a brief piece in the Wall Street Journal, also calling on a lot of the coverage from the Atlantic lately about the internet, especially Facebook, and suggested that the Atlantic had arrived at max shriek awfully quickly, leaving further room for escalation. He was citing Adrienne LaFrance talking about Facebook as a doomsday machine, and our friend Maria Ressa talking about it as an atom bomb exploded in our information ecosystem. So we're seeing, I think, fairly broad extremes of coverage. I would recommend to you a book by Neeraj Weiss-Blatt called Techlash, just out in a lower priced paperback, that looked at the coverage of the internet as a whole from technology, and she noted what she saw as a hard pivot from kind of utopian to dystopian, coincidental with the election of Donald Trump. And we can theorize about why that may be, but I think that we can agree that, especially since the Haugen papers, the coverage of Facebook has been pretty uniformly negative. And so the question I would start to like to put to our esteemed guests here is, what should the coverage be? What is its purpose? What are we trying to accomplish in covering? I think we've gotten to the point where the idea that Facebook can be harmful to democracy is widely held. I'm not saying it's universally held, but that idea is certainly out there and well understood. And so, having got to this max shriek, as the latter piece in the journal said, I don't think the goal anymore is to scream about danger and warnings. I think it has to be something else. I think we have to accomplish something else with our coverage. So I just want to start it off there and ask, how do we cover social media, particularly Facebook, and to what end? Meredith, I'll start with you again.
Thanks, Jeff. I think the first thing that we need to remember is that journalism's function is to provide people with information that they can use to make decisions in their lives, how to interrogate certain problems, how to connect with different people. And so if we put Facebook inside of that framework and coverage of Facebook more specifically, we think about, what can I tell the average user of Facebook about their use, or about the use of other people within their region, their country, or another country in the world where the use might be very different? What can I tell them that's useful that would help with perhaps a behavioral change or even just a different way of thinking about what this social networking platform is and does. How do I stretch their understanding so that it goes beyond, well, Facebook is the place where I go to connect with my family members, to connect with members of my community, and to understand that in certain parts of the world, Facebook is the internet. It is the way that people maintain connections to one another. And so what are the consequences of this private company being a connector for so many people? That said, it's necessary to move this coverage of Facebook from being almost this mystery being, this black box that we don't know much about other than the way it shows up in our own lives, and to focus on very applied understanding of what it means to be someone, to be one of the millions, if not billions of users on this platform who is contributing to it in some way. And I think when we put the actual user, and I always advocate for the most vulnerable among us, being put at the center of those decisions, our coverage decisions, then we begin to get some more nuanced coverage that focuses on the stories and making connections between this change in the interface or this change in the way that people are putting up and receiving information. And that operationalizes Facebook as an entity in a way that most people can understand, access, and then sort of understand their connection to it and what they can do or do differently in order to prevent or mitigate harm.
Can I ask another question? Your former colleague and our mutual friend, Siva Vaidyanathan, wrote Anti-Social Media. And Siva, I don't want to misquote him or missummarize him, but pretty much says that the ideal of Facebook to connect the world was a bad idea, was a dangerous idea.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with that?
Somewhat. So of course, Siva's got a whole chapter and really the whole book that gets into the details about that. And that's one of the things that I emphasize. Human beings are not good at nuance. And so you have to make a statement that is as provocative as connecting the whole world is a bad idea for people to understand why there are difficulties in connecting the whole world. So the argument that Siva is making there is that what Facebook failed to consider is that not everyone who is going to come onto that platform is going to be acting in good faith. And I do think that it was a bad idea to proceed with such a lofty goal without considering what some of the unintended consequences of reaching that goal might be. And that's the problem where we all find ourselves trying to grapple and trying to deal with the aftermath of Facebook being marginally successful in its goal in connecting the world.
Paul, you and your colleagues in your center have tried to work with the platforms, plural, but I think especially Facebook, to try to show them a better way. Is it possible to do that? You've done that for a few years now. Do you come at it now with more or less optimism that it's possible to improve things?
Thanks, Jeff. I don't think Mark Zuckerberg has woken up on any morning, slapped his forehead and said, NYU has finally shown me the light. It's very hard to tell what any single engagement with an organization as big and internally varied as Facebook might be. I think we're one voice in a much larger chorus, giving Facebook a lot of advice. I think some of that advice is taken. I think Facebook has embraced a variety of improvements, ranging from strengthening its human and automated content moderation systems to fiddling with various features, to conceding that the traditional contention that we are not arbiters of the truth and we can never comment on anything having to do with accuracy, moving off that unrealistic position to more nuanced positions. All that said, that's all on the positive side. On balance, I think Facebook and the industry at large, have not taken sufficient steps to self-regulate, and that has contributed to the push in Congress and elsewhere for government intervention, an approach which we, 5 years ago, were saying Facebook's got to change so they can avoid government regulation because of all those First Amendment complications and so forth. You don't want the government having to get involved. Well, they didn't change enough. The government's involved. It's a very chaotic and so far unproductive, demolition derby in Washington. But I think we have to continue to try to find some modest, government approach to complement what the companies are doing, because we'll never succeed, with the government alone. The First Amendment restrictions are too complicated, and we don't want the government to aggressively getting involved in anything having to do with content policies or decisions. So in the end, the companies will have to improve themselves if we're going to see better platforms. So a mixed view from me.
Jacqueline, I'll come to you next. If we stipulate there's a problem, is the problem fixable?
I do think the problem's fixable, but I do think it's a multi-pronged approach, right? We work with journalists, but we also, advocacy researchers, journalists, folks in civil society organizations have seen really what's been in things like the whistleblower papers for a long time, right? We've been looking at the harms perpetuated by Facebook, but really thinking about how do we change them. And I think what civil society organizations are doing right now is trying to take the field out of silos and really identify the problem and work on it through, monitoring to understand how, with where I work in communities of color, and thinking about what harms are being targeted and leveraged against them. And this is really nothing new. We have the concrete facts of what happened thanks to the whistleblower papers, but this goes far back as 2016, as we know, with fake, Black Lives Matter and different sorts of pages targeted towards movement to cause division. We look at how Black users online have been frequently removed just for mentioning anything about racial division or racism. We look at the Black feminists who really saw the threat of the alt-right coming years ago, way before Gamergate, and way before we got to something as tragic as the Capitol riots, right? So, but it's like every time we blow the whistle, these tiny kind of micro bifurcated changes are made on the part of Facebook to say, hey, we've removed some accounts. They did it before the January 6th and the election. They're now doing it before the election that's going to happen in the Philippines in a couple of weeks. But this isn't good enough. We see that changes really need to be made on a large scale level. And I think that's what a lot of civil society organizations are trying to do, researchers who are trying to gain access to the data to really understand what's proliferating on the platform, thinking about policy measures that we can take, such as pressure within the FTC, thinking about how to stop the exploitative business models of these platforms when it comes to algorithms, and other kind of mechanisms that, take our data. So I just really think that the approach is going to be multifaceted, right? The government isn't completely the answer, but we have to have pressure on these platforms, particularly Facebook. We have to think about what measures we can take within legislative measures. And then we also need to think about, and media literacy plays a very small part, because I also do not think we should put the onus on the people. I think that we should prepare the people through media literacy and training and best practices and narrative change, but there needs to be something greater. And that's what we're working on.
Mike, you know how much I respect your work in the atmosphere of the Max Shriek. You're often a voice of considered sanity in trying to understand what's going on, critical of the platforms, but also critical of media coverage. I'll put the first question back to you. What should the purpose of journalistic coverage of social media be now?
That's a very, very big question. I think, and I've been having this discussion a lot lately, there's obviously a whole bunch of different factors here. And I think it's both easy and extraordinarily understandable why people sort of search for the kind of simple narrative, this caused that, which makes sense. Everyone is kind of trying to understand the world. I think it would be really helpful if people began to understand that these things are a lot more complex, and there are a lot more variables than sort of anyone is really willing to grapple with. And I'm not sure that we can grapple with all of the different variables and all of the different things going on. And so I think it would be really useful if there was a more concerted effort to start to break these things down bit by bit and more carefully. And one of the things that I've said a few times recently is that, I think it's fairly clear that there are a whole bunch of different things happening with social media. And some of that is that it is shining a light on problems of society that have always been there that we didn't know about. And some of it is that social media may be amplifying bad things that are happening in society and connecting people who, when connected to each other, are leading to bad actions. It is also connecting people who, when connected together, are able to do good things. And there are all of these different factors, and it's very easy to jump in and say, we are seeing this bad thing happen. Social media was involved, therefore social media is at fault. And I think that is a very simplistic story that might be true in some cases, but often is not. And when journalists sort of jump to that easy narrative without actually exploring how much of this was, this bad thing was going to happen no matter what, or this bad thing was already happening, we just didn't know about it before, or sort of looking at how big is the bad thing that's happening as compared to other good things that are happening, we don't get a really complete picture. And instead we sort of get this narrative that leads to that sort of, peak shriek or whatever the phrase was. And so, what I would love to see from journalists and from researchers and everyone else who's sort of watching and participating in this event is this sort of, can we start to get more to the nuance and look at ways, can we start to pick apart, which of the different things are actually at play, which of the things that we see that everyone agrees is problematic because of social media, versus that it's just social media showing it so that we see it. And then, we can discuss what is the best way to deal with this sort of large societal problem. And I think that would be a lot more useful and reasonable than immediately saying, well, we're seeing this bad thing, we're seeing it on social media, therefore social media is the problem, we must do something about social media, as opposed to doing something about whatever the underlying problematic behavior is.
Yes, any moral panic becomes an excuse not to deal with underlying problems.
Yeah.
And to blame the folk devil for them. I want to plug one little activity out of my school and center right now, which I think is relevant to a question I want to ask. And by the way, I'll throw out one more jump ball question for everybody, and then please interrupt yourselves and don't need me. I hired a brilliant graduate of our school, Ndiara Towns, who also works at the Aspen Institute, to start to gather research on internet impact from academics so that we can share that, especially with journalists and also policymakers. And the Twitter handle is TKC Internet, as in Town Knight Center Internet, and her Medium page is Redesigning the Internet. So I recommend that you look at it, and I'd love to hear your response to the work that she's begun, because I think it is vital to the point that a few of you have made, is to get to the nuance, to find the way to get nuance into the journalistic coverage. And I think that comes from academic research. So the next thing I'd like to address in the spirit of the whole afternoon is the next panel and the research panel. A few questions for any of you who want to take this is, what research, from the journalistic perspective, of the kind of coverage that we have or should have of the internet and social media, what research is needed? Secondarily, how do we get that in the hands of journalists, and how do we convince them that it's worthwhile to listen to researchers and understand the value of academics? But let's start with, what are some of the questions that we wish either are being answered in research? See Axel Brunn's book, Are Filter Bubbles Real? And it just doesn't get called upon, or more to the point, what research isn't yet being done that should be funded, that would be valuable to a more nuanced coverage of social media, the public on it, and the internet. Anybody want that?
Jeff, can I offer a suggestion?
Sure.
Yes, and before I do, I want to just make one observation. I mean, so far we've been talking about media coverage, and you've offered the only thing that's on the table is peak shriek, as if that represents the body of journalism. And of course it doesn't. You could have mentioned, along with the headlines you did mention, altogether, much calmer sounding, but still, critical and possibly even nuanced coverage of social media. So as the world is complicated and it should be approached with attention to nuance. So we should be fair and representative in describing the journalism that's been done. It's not exclusively the pieces you mentioned. As I think your question about what needs researching is a great one. I agree with you that more research is good across the board. And I think questions like that may be simplistic sounding, but what makes content go viral on a given platform as compared to other platforms? What are the characteristics of content that spreads dramatically to the point where we actually care about it, as opposed to some fringe comment that's seen by 100 people and goes away? What aspects of the algorithms, what aspects of the content itself? Questions like that, I would love to see academics try to get their arms around.
Meredith, academic.
Yes, I'm going to go back to what I mentioned earlier, and that is putting vulnerable people at the center of the research. And I really mean at the center of the research. So not necessarily as subjects, but as researchers. People who, Jacqueline mentioned this earlier, Black feminists, far beyond Gamergate, before 2016, even as far back as 2012, 2013, Black feminists on the internet were calling out sock puppet accounts and saying, there is something wrong here and someone needs to be paying attention, and bringing more of these individuals who are seeing firsthand the effects of digital media use, social media use, and how it is abused, and allowing them to dictate the terms of the research, I think will give us much more nuanced research products to begin with. So many of us in the academy are trained in very specific ways. We're almost pedantic in the way that we talk about how other people do things online. We aren't very good at ceding and sharing control with others. And I think that has been replicated in the work that even prompted this panel to exist, the Facebook papers itself. As I look through the Facebook papers, and I'm sorry, it's a bit of a departure here, and rather the coverage of the Facebook papers, because I haven't seen the Facebook papers. And it's one thing if, they are embargoed and journalism organizations can't make them public, but I find it really interesting that if you want to get a look at what's written in those Facebook papers, you either have to know someone who is a journalist or otherwise have some backdoor into them. So we've got this gatekeeping mechanism that replicates itself not only in the journalistic side, but also on the research side. And that is going to continue to lead us in circles. Yes, we'll get some traction in terms of what we can scrape with big data, what we can observe with having thousands of dollars at our discretion in order to purchase data or in order to create our own data sets. But we will not be able to get the sort of granular insights that we need in order to understand what are some of the implications of a particular affordance being rolled out, or particular groups and language being able to thrive in certain corners of Facebook. We will never get to those subtle nuances that Mike mentioned unless we sort of shift our focus on who's doing the research and who are they putting at the center of that research. So not so much what's the output, what sort of subjects do we need? There's plenty of research out there that talks about how different groups are being abused, how different features of Facebook are being exploited. We've got all of that. The thing that we need is different researchers.
Jacqueline, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Meredith. I mean, I think we know that newsrooms do not always represent the communities they're meant to serve. I previously worked for an organization, Facebook, where we would connect journalists with researchers in order to work on stories. However, that can be effective, but there is a lack of researchers of color or researchers working on certain issues, right? If we're just going to top tier universities to ask folks, what's going on, we're not really going to get to the core of a lot of these issues. We can talk about this with, things that revolved around COVID. There were researchers in Black communities, in Latinx communities telling people, hi, this isn't all historical traumas in Tuskegee, although it may be some, it's also lack of access. We have all sorts of mis and disinformation related to the election that you saw coming in Spanish language because we lack a real sense of, a monitoring and a kind of capacity around looking at things in other languages, Mandarin included, right? The researchers that we work with within DDL are looking at these things in language. So it's not just important to say, connect journalists with researchers to kind of fill these data deficits and data voids. It's more to say, where are we finding these researchers? How do we foster these researchers? They do not need to be at, necessarily a Harvard or a Stanford, right? We can find, researchers and even train. Something that we like to do is train the trainer. I think that people can really be equipped with these tools if they work with folks at institutions. And I think it's really important for researchers to seek out people who work in advocacy and in organizing and get to that place where they can work with folks on the ground. And then we actually have something that is effective, because once you work with folks on the ground, you have trusted messengers, you get that word out beyond just social media and, into people's hands.
Since you bring up the representation in the newsroom, I cannot pass up asking Meredith about the shameful record of the journalism industry in even counting what exists. Meredith, you wrote about this just, I guess, yesterday. If you don't mind, can you just take us through where things stand with your work on newsrooms and representation? Because I think it obviously informs the discussion then about the research as well.
Absolutely. So for the past 3 years, almost 4 now, I've run the News Leaders Association's annual newsroom diversity survey. It's actually a census of the different demographics that are represented in print and digital newsrooms throughout the United States. The survey is older than I am. I'm 42. The project is 44 years old. It was an outcome of the Kerner Commission's report in the late 1960s about the failure of mainstream news media to properly integrate, and thus its failures and shortcomings in creating coverage of Black communities in particular, but diverse communities as a whole. And what we are seeing again is a replication of the same sort of power structures that raised the alarm back then being a problem now. If you don't have not just representation in the newsroom, but influence among people who come from different parts of society, we're going to continue to get the same sort of stories over and over and over again. One of the problems that we've seen is that there are news organizations that frankly just won't turn over their data. They won't be candid and frank about who's on their staff, who's represented among their staff. And so one of the things that we know is that from those organizations that are participating, we're not making progress in terms of integration and actual inclusion when it comes to getting diverse perspectives in the news. And the way that connects to the coverage that we get of social media is that we get skewed coverage of the stories that actually matter. We have skewed perspectives about why certain people are using different platforms and the way that they're using them. We have a lack of information about why someone would seek out a platform like Facebook to find information and why they're more likely to believe what's posted there versus what they're getting from a news outlet in their hometown or something that's trusted that they do not trust and haven't for generations because they have been systematically ignored. And until we investigate what those connections are, we are going to continue to miss the point. It goes right back to, again, everything that Jacqueline and Mike were saying, that we have to dig deep into the nuance, and that goes from everything to who's on staff at particular publications and what kind of journalism are they producing, to even who's on staff at something like Facebook. What kind of training do the engineers and the folks who come up with our experiences on this platform have? How do they see the world? How do they see the user? And what does that mean for the way that we are able to connect with one another and to share information with one another and to receive that information? And those are some of the questions that we really need to get to, and that we're at a loss with the data voids unless we understand, who's behind the machine and what their motivations are.
And again, to repeat, it's a shameful record on journalism's part and on news organizations' part. Let me stay on this for one more second, then I'll get to you, Mike. does a similar, I think you raised this, Jacqueline, so you both have, about who's doing the research. Is there then, if we were to look at the body of research that exists and the people who are doing it, I'm hearing from you that there's a similar problem with representation there. And what do we do about that? How do we center on others? You said training the trainers, training the researchers. Are there other strategies that would affect the research and in turn, then one would hope the journalism?
I really think it comes down to connection. I really think it comes down to kind of a definition of how we, advocacy research, is extremely just as important as, institutional research. And I really think that if we value these kind of qualitative data sets, this data that's been collected by working within community, that's a really good way to foster, right, that kind of connection.
Mike, finally to you, since you're the journalist here covering the internet and social media, what would be useful to you? And you actually do read research, unlike I think some journalists. What would be useful to you from the research community in your coverage?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there has been a lot of actually really useful research, and in listening to this, I sort of want to build a little bit on what Meredith was saying, because I think it was exactly right. And one of the things that let me give an example, and I think I'll come around to the point that I'm making. I just went pretty deep looking at a bunch of research in a few different areas regarding social media usage, and one was on communities discussing suicide, and another was on communities around eating disorders. And both are really interesting, because if you look at a lot of the reporting, not all, some of the reporting has been really good, but if you look at some of the reporting on those things, it feels like the journalism standpoint for many people is sort of like a kind of a savior complex. Here are people who are a problem. We need to come in and announce that this is a problem and it needs to be solved. And often the solution that is proposed is that these discussions are bad and they must be stopped. But if you actually look at a lot of the more thoughtful, careful research, which actually involves going and talking to people who have experience within these communities or experience facing these issues, then the story becomes a lot more nuanced and a lot more complex. And so there's this part of me in going through that. So just for example, like the eating disorder one, which maybe is a little bit easier to talk about to some extent. There was this sort of big push that, noting that like on Instagram and Facebook, there were these sort of eating disorder communities, and there was a big push to try and ban that, and so ban any discussion on eating disorders because of the belief that it was like driving more people to engage in dangerous behavior, and what the actual research found was that didn't work for a variety of reasons. First of all, as soon as people would try and put bans on certain words, and immediately people would come up with different language to get around those bans, and you would have the same discussion but with code words, and that didn't do much good. But the other thing that was really interesting was that there was some research that really took a step back and sort of, instead of looking narrowly at like there is a discussion of eating disorders on Instagram, what should be done about it, or Tumblr. There was I think there was a big focus on discussions on eating disorders on Tumblr. They took a step back and looked at sort of the wider, the fact that the world exists beyond just that platform, and these discussions are happening on multiple platforms, sometimes in overlapping ways. And what they began to realize was that over and over again they found people who were engaging in dangerous behavior, but by participating in these communities began to actually realize that what they were doing was dangerous and that there might be a path out, and were able to find help to dealing with the underlying problems that they were facing. And so what I found really useful about that was the ability to take a step back and not just look at this narrowly and say, there's discussions of dangerous behavior here, and it may be leading people towards more dangerous behavior, but saying over time and across different platforms, how does this conversation go? How does it change? And what is the overall impact? And they did that by actually talking to people in that community, and began to realize that there was this sort of shift, in part, I think, because of some of this research that recognized that, when these communities were allowed to exist and were done in a way that allowed experts to, as well, to sort of come in and help guide people towards healthier solutions, it was actually a really effective intervention, as opposed to just sort of scolding it and saying, we have to shut this down. And so I think that it was really useful, in a number of different ways. One, as Meredith was noting, when you have people who actually understand the communities and are not just sort of coming in and saying like, we must save you, that helped get to what was really happening. The second thing was taking that wider perspective, not just saying like, oh, I see this bad thing on this platform, but like, let's look at the overall wider community. How do they interact? How do they communicate with each other? If we shut down this particular community, do they just show up somewhere else? And is that more dangerous? Which is actually what's happened with discussions on suicide, where basically every major platform has shut down conversations on suicide. And now there are these sort of much more sketchy forums, without without the sort of guardrails that were on the more established platforms. And I'm not sure that that's a better solution. So I really wish that, that we were getting more research like that, like that we saw with eating disorders, and we're starting to see a little bit with suicide, that recognize all of these different factors, take a wider perspective, and try and understand what's actually happening on the ground, as opposed to just coming in and saying, this is bad, we have to stop this, or we have to save people.
I think that takes us back to where Meredith started us off at the beginning of the panel. Much of the coverage today, I sense, is aimed at policy, at regulators and legislators, and at change in the industry at a high level, and also thus at the companies themselves. But Meredith, you started off asking about service to the users. And one of my many heresies is that I'm not a big adherent of media literacy and news literacy. Here I agree with Dana Boyd that there are risks in telling our young people, especially, even though, as Josh and company have shown, the young people are all right. It's grandpa who's messing up the world, passing around the junk, to badly summarize your own research here at CSMAP. So the kind of paternalistic view of media literacy, that if we can tell you how to use this, everything will be okay, I personally put that aside. But I think a service angle of what do people need to know about their lives on social media, not from saviors, but from each other, from research, from a larger perspective and context. What would a public-oriented coverage of social media potentially look like? Any of you? Jacqueline?
Well, I think for most people, after Cambridge Analytica and how we think about data, we kind of keep talking into the void about it. People kind of have accepted that Facebook has this data, or that platforms have this data about them, and there's nothing that they can do about it, and that it doesn't actually get worse as these business models get more and more exploitative. So I think something that we really have to do is limit the technological collection and use of our personal information through data minimization, and really enhance our privacy that we have towards these companies.
Anyone else on that question? We have a few questions in the, I'm trying to look at the chat and the Q&A. Please feel free to put your stuff. I think the people running this would like you to use the Q&A, but I'm fine with either. And stretching this out beyond the American presumption here. So one from Zeev says that the Facebook papers highlighted many of the harms that the platforms cause domestically, but one of the key takeaways in his reading is the extent of the harms in the global South and global majority. And what are the current barriers to increasing coverage of the effects of social media in other countries, and how can they be overcome? And then somewhere here from Benjamin, how do academic researchers in places like Africa get attention to those academics working on studies effects of social media in their societies? Also note that the big techs have gatekeepers in these regions who are funded. The international perspective, especially the global South. Any thoughts? Meredith, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, I think it marries really well with what Jacqueline was just mentioning. And so I think about the power differential and how the coverage that we need is not the coverage that we're getting, because that coverage does not appeal to the people who have the most money to spend, to the people who have the most time to spend. We recognize now that the problems with Facebook did not become everyone's problem until it became a problem at home, really, until after the 2016 election. Whereas in the years leading up to the 2016 election, in countries throughout the world, there were people using Facebook as a platform to spread misinformation, to harm marginalized groups, to organize campaigns of people who were essentially lynch mobs in order to inflict violence on their neighbors. And so the problem that I sit with, and to go back to your question about sort of what do we need right now, is that we need to find a way to make those problems sort of out there, outside of the United States, our problems, and to connect those to the people at home and understand that what happens out there isn't separate from what's happening here. I really appreciate the question being raised about how do researchers in African countries connect and get this sort of data. It's like, if you're outside of the United States, or if you're outside of Western Europe, you're almost an afterthought when it comes to doing research and creating things that help the world to understand what some of the very intricate problems we are facing are. And so I think one of the pushes that we could make, both individually and collectively, as we're doing things like advocating for restrictions on our data use, or even getting more clarity about how our data is used, is to band folks together to advocate for better policies. We now see that because of GDPR in the European Union, there are a number of companies that operate in the United States that have had to change the way that they do business, and at least the things that they tell us about the data that they're collecting and the way that that data is used. There is nothing that says that we cannot continue to push these companies for more ethical behaviors by connecting with people outside of the United States, learning from the experiences they are having, and amplifying those stories and the details of those stories to advocate for the kind of reforms that do not simply help us in the US, but that help others throughout the world who are experiencing the same problems we have, whom we frankly just aren't paying enough attention to.
Paul, I know you've been emphasizing this international need to the platforms and had conversations with them. I was in Ukraine 3-4 years ago, and they were complaining that there was no one at Facebook who understood Ukraine. That's certainly has to change now. And the manipulation that was going on by Russian actors against Ukrainian journalists and Ukrainian users was extreme at the time, but it was hard to get that across.
Yep.
Have you seen, I guess, what has your recommendations been? And have you seen any, secondarily, have you seen any progress? But more importantly, what, in your view, should the platforms be doing about this?
Yeah, well, I mean, in a couple of words, much more. And that's their answer. That yes, you're right. We were way behind for many years, but now we're on it. Now we're scrambling, and we used to have, the capacity to pay attention to 25 countries outside of the U.S., and now it's 50 countries, or whatever the claim may be. And I think that that's all pretty accurate, except the problem is it's not sufficient, it's not enough, and it doesn't get you off the hook, and therefore the pressure should remain on you because of the sort of original sin of going for maximum growth in maximum markets with barely a thought given to the guardrails or the potential side effects that might come about by opening your platforms to people in all these markets that you don't understand, and where you don't understand the issues as well. As to the coverage, I would of course agree with our colleagues who are saying that there should be much more attention, both in terms of person power and in terms of space in publications and emphasis. All of that makes sense. It's true not just in coverage of tech; it's true across the board. I mean, our journalism is too parochial in general, and that's a problem that the journalists have to accept and act on. So I think that the companies are actually in motion. They are trying to do better, but that's only a result of the outside criticism and pressure they've faced. And the pressure has to remain, otherwise the progress will diminish and taper off.
Jacqueline, this is something you work in internationally.
Right. And, I'm just thinking about how, these different sorts of narratives continue to proliferate in other languages. And some of that is incoming from other countries. So I just think that we need to continue to, as we say, put pressure on these platforms in order to change a lot of their policies. I see there is, a question about, how we're losing even access to CrowdTangle.
That was my next question. Yes.
Right. I'm sorry.
No. Go there. Go there. That's what I'm saying.
Right,
Yes.
right. That really was a primary access point for journalists, right? And losing that kind of social listening tool is going to be a real hindrance to folks who are looking at data, right? We now, if this was the bare minimum, right? We're getting out of CrowdTangle. Some of the data realized we're missing a lot of information, right? So if this was what we were working with and there's no substitution, then how are we all going to come together and kind of unify about what we're seeing around the world and say that this is what we're seeing? So I think that needs more attention.
Mike, were you using CrowdTangle for your coverage, or what kind of data sources do you find?
I used CrowdTangle a little bit, but I had sort of moved away from it towards other things. I've literally spent the last few weeks trying to get access to some other data for some research that I've been working on. And one of the things that I've noticed is, a lot of the sources of data don't seem to have policies for journalists and researchers to get access to them. They're all designed for sort of corporate systems where they want $10,000 a month subscription because they're expecting you're like using it for Wall Street, to make billions of dollars or whatever. And so like I've literally spent the last few weeks trying to convince a long list of data providers to give me access to their platforms as a journalist, because I it would be really useful for explaining certain things. And in particular, the research that I'm working on right now is specific to non-US countries. And so I'm trying to find data sources that have access to, what is happening in this or that country so that I can explore it. And part of the reason why I want to do that, and this gets back to the earlier question as well, is that I would like to be setting up comparisons between different similar countries that have put in place different policies, and what is the impact? What are we actually seeing on the ground? But actually getting access to that data, is really difficult. I'm currently negotiating with a number of different providers that do that. And then just one other point to get back to that earlier question as well, regarding, in particular the Global South and other areas that don't get as much attention. I find it a little bit amusing. I don't know if amusing is the right word, but that we hear all these discussions sort of blaming the business model of social media for all of the ills that we see, and there may be something to that. But part of the reason why journalists aren't covering what is happening in a lot of these countries is because for the business model of journalism, those stories don't get enough attention. Therefore, they're not valuable enough. The editors won't assign them. The publishers don't want them. And therefore, we don't get coverage of those other countries. And so I think, to Meredith's point, it was exactly right, is that we have to figure out ways to connect them to what is happening here. And that feels kind of like, we shouldn't have to do that, right? These are serious stories, and we should be able to get coverage of them in serious ways without having to bring it back. But because of sort of the business model of journalism, nobody's going to pay attention to those stories unless we somehow figure out a way to tie them back to what's going on here.
One quick comment on what Mike just said. I think I agree with much of it, but the reference to business models, I think, is a little bit off. The theory on social media is that the nature of the advertising engagement-driven business model actually inadvertently, not intentionally, not because the platforms want to promote and amplify polarizing or hateful or material that undermines trust in elections. They don't want to do that, but they tend to do it because they've set up a business model that favors promoting certain types of conduct. The business model issue with journalism is not that, with serious journalism organizations, is not that they're like inadvertently not covering things in Africa. No, they're making a conscious decision not to do that for a very simple reason. That isn't really the business model. It costs something. It's expensive. It's expensive, and so they don't do it. They would prefer to put money, in things that are sort of surer, easier bets, and they don't want to spend money on these other things. So that's not to excuse that, not to say that can't be fixed. It can be. You can change your priorities, but it's not exactly parallel situation.
And to be clear, I wasn't saying it was the same. I was just noting that both of them are sort of business model issues to some extent. I think that there are business model issues involved in all of that, right? It's just the nature of incentives, right? No matter what, we're living in a world where there are incentives and there are different structures of incentives, and there's lots of things that we would like to see that don't happen because the incentives aren't there. And if we want to get that kind of coverage, or if we want to get that kind of research, then the incentives need to be there. And there are all different ways of looking at that. But right now, on the journalistic side, the incentives are not to do that kind of work for the most part. There are obvious exceptions. I'm not saying that none of that research gets done or none of that reporting gets done, but there are incentives there.
Well,
and I would add, I'm sorry, really quickly, Jeff,
please.
I would
jump in and say,
yes, foreign coverage and coverage outside of the United States, enacting a bureau, paying a stringer, someone like that is really expensive, but it doesn't cost that much to cover the hood. It doesn't cost that much to cover rural America, and so there are choices, and I'm really echoing what Paul was saying. There are choices that journalism's business models are making, and those choices are to appeal to the interests of the elite, of those who have money, who have influence, and who are able to essentially move journalistic organizations into a specific direction and keep our eyes focused on people like us.
Well, yes, I think the business model is shared. It is an attention-based business model built on mass and scale. And what the internet enables is to break out of the mass and break out of scale and see people as individuals and communities. But the support of that and the business models around that are still built on the media invention of an attention-based business model and scale. And so I think that a lot of the innovation we need is on those business models. To understand new business models built around scale. Before the mechanization and industrialization of print, the average circulation of a daily newspaper in the US was 4,000. And like a Substack newsletter, that was enough. But now we see a world where obviously you need high scale. I'd like to circle back to Steve's question about data and CrowdTangle as a way to get to a regulatory question in honor of that being the third panel of the day, if I may. So shift gears just a moment here. I think that CrowdTangle, I think, was bollocksed up in a fair number of ways by Facebook. And the data itself was misinterpreted often by media. And Facebook could have sat down and openly explained where it was misinterpreted. But instead, they kind of pulled back the whole thing. And that was another PR move that didn't help them in the way. And they I don't want to say hide behind. Every time there's a call for data from them, they say, but Cambridge Analytica, and they've got a bit of a point there. But I think I hear in the regulatory discussion an opportunity for government's role to be demanding data of the platforms for research. I was on a transatlantic working group on content moderation and freedom of expression that was brought together by Susan Ness, former FCC commissioner. And that became the basis of the group's recommendation, which you can look up online, or I can send it to you if anybody wants it, that it's about accountability through transparency. And the transparency would be going to researchers. And so the core question of data here, I think there might be an opportunity that if we see regulators and legislators, rather, starting to say, you've got to hand over more data, you've got to be more transparent. I think the question comes to journalists and researchers both: what data, why? What is it we need to learn what? Under what presumption? And if we had that opportunity to talk to legislators and say, add this in, if we could, I don't want to turn us into lobbyists, Lord knows, but if we had the opportunity to just have a discussion about what would be useful to assure transparency from the platforms about their impact on society. Can you imagine what it is? So I can ask this question two ways. what do you still want from the platforms that's better than CrownTable was? Or another way to ask it is, what would you like regulators and legislators to require of platforms in terms of data to be able to go to researchers, if that makes any sense? Meredith, as the researcher here.
Yeah, I'm nodding because it makes sense. I can't say exactly what I would want from an organization like Facebook. I have to really claim my lane and say that, there are definitely things that I would be interested in, the behavior of particular groups on Facebook and what have you. My push would be for something a little more general and more to the lines of infrastructure. I would want our legislators to demand that these companies make the data sets that they're going to make available, publicly available through land-grant universities in every single state, through those universities that serve historically marginalized populations, and that those things have to be freely available to people, short of doing something like providing an email address so that you can receive communication, so that you can receive the data. There should not be many barriers to actually getting it. I would like for them to push for the sort of release of data that doesn't require someone to have to invest hours of their time to think about how someone on the other end of this equation might review an application and say, yes, this is of interest to us, so we're going to give you what you need. I would like to see that come into some sort of clearinghouse that's readily available, so that if you are not within a university and you want to conduct this sort of research, you can do it. But if you need some assistance, if you want some insight from someone who has gone to school and learned how to use data in particular ways, and you need that for methodologies or what have you, then you have a listing of experts who are there and able to help you. I would really like to see that sort of connectivity. To me, that's the sort of public-private partnership that we should be advocating for.
Jacqueline?
I agree, Meredith. We need enhanced data transparency. This transparency needs to be democratized, and we all deserve to know what kinds of information companies and data brokers know about us, and really to have what sort of things are actually off limits. I mean, there's an incredibly amount of private information about citizens, individual sex, their gender, their geolocation, their health information. Search histories can reveal your mental health facility you go to, or your religious affiliation, and they don't disclose, what information they collect or where they get the information and who shares the data with them, who they share the data with, how they share this data to profile us. I mean, I could go on and on, but we really need to really have an idea of the harmful data that is collected, about our communities to really make change.
Paul, you have any perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the proposals made so far make total sense to me. You could look at some of the basic debates that have coalesced in recent years. On the outside, we say that it seems that the prioritization of engagement leads to unintended bad effects. The companies answer, well, that doesn't make any sense. It's illogical because it's not in our commercial interest, let alone our moral interest, to allow for or to prioritize material that would be harmful. Like we would put ourselves out of business. All right. I think a lot of companies do a lot of stupid things that could put them out of business. I don't think that's much of an answer to start with. But beyond that, great. We have a dispute here. What's the actual information? We don't know. What are the elements that go into an algorithm that has the ability to rank content, to recommend content, or even to remove content? I'm not saying they need to just like open the door to everything they own, all their intellectual property, but surely there can be a way to convey to the outside world, perhaps academics only in some cases, if it's material that has some legal protection or there's a privacy concern, but in many cases it should be completely public, to let us know if you say you're not maximizing engagement, what are the top 10 ingredients that go into that machine that ranks material? How are they weighted? How does that change given outside circumstances? Because you've conceded that at certain moments you change that arrangement, then you change it back. So show us the goods.
Even to have a discussion of definitions
Sure.
is useful.
Sure.
I sat after the working group, we had meetings with various technology companies. And I remember one discussion about how things are demoted and trying to quantify that. And one of the people from the company said, every decision we make about putting things up is either promotion or demotion. So to say that there's a countable demotion, that language didn't work for them. So we need different language. We need to be able to discuss. Okay, let's get that. Mike, you as a researcher.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different thoughts here. I would like to see a world in which the questions around data are really that the end users have both access and control, of their data and how it's used, and that includes being able to share it with researchers. So I think there is this separate issue, which is not, I get worried whenever we're sort of reliant on the companies to decide which data they're going to disclose in different ways. What I would like is for the companies not to be able to stop users from collecting their own data and sharing it with researchers, sort of the Ad Observatory issue.
Oh, NYU, yes.
Right. Where, I think there are a lot of things that policymakers can do to stop the ability of a company like Facebook to say, no, you can't scrape our data and make use of it for research. And so, my focus would be more on, how do we allow users to offer their own data, set it up so they can collect it themselves, whether it's an extension or some other system, and be able to voluntarily know who they're sharing it with and choose to share it with researchers for the sake of being able to do useful research with it, rather than waiting for the companies to sort of, whether it's forced to or voluntarily decide to share that data.
As we come to the end, I think it would probably be malpractice on my part if we had a panel about journalistic coverage of online and social media without bringing up Section 230. And I guess this is an opportunity for Mike to shriek about Mike has a great page, by the way. If you don't know, what's the title of that page? You have been sent here because you said something wrong about Section 230.
Right,
if you Google that, you will find the page. It is a brilliant
Hello, you've been referred here because you're wrong about 230. Yeah, Section 230. Yes.
So the impact of, since we have regulators in the last part of this, and Paul, you're right to say that there's tons of wonderful coverage out there. I was looking at the total realm of where we've landed, but I will say around Section 230, the coverage is pretty bad and pretty and doesn't understand the essence of the freedom of expression. So just for a quick hit, each of us, starting off with you, Mike, what should be done about the coverage of 230? What are the dangers if we don't fix that?
Read that piece. I mean, I think Section 230 has become this sort of, talisman of everything that's bad. And I think that I have another piece which is half written and I need to finish it at some point, but it's basically, what problem are you trying to solve and why changing Section 230 won't solve that? No matter what problem you look at as you go down the issue. The issue is almost never anything to do with Section 230. The value, there are a whole bunch of different things. And again, I know we're running out of time, so I could go on I could take up everybody else's panel, but the value of Section 230 in a lot of ways is that it allows for experimentation. And I wish that we had, that sort of recognition. And as we're looking at other policy changes, that we are looking at ways to allow for experimentation, because all of this is these complex ideas where iteration is so important, and coming in with sort of, as most of the reforms to 230 are trying to do, with a sort of like, this is the way it has to be done, doesn't work. And that's kind of the underlying point in all of this, is that, the sort of top-down approach of saying this will fix everything doesn't take into account all of the different nuances and all of the different challenges, and the fact that the society changes and people react. So if you change this, people are going to change how they behave. And if you have it in law, you're not going to be able to react and make the necessary changes as society itself changes. And I'll leave it there.
Anyone else on 230 before we wrap up? No. All right. Well, we're actually go ahead.
Tinkering with a deregulatory statute, a statute that doesn't regulate, it protects against regulation via litigation, is not the path for thoroughgoing reform. So to that extent, I agree with Mike. I guess I disagree with the idea that there's no possible way that any revision of Section 230 could possibly solve anything. But that's not a program for affirmative oversight of the industry. To do that, I think you have to try something like the Consumer Protection Authority of the Federal Trade Commission.
Anyone else? Well, Azim's here. I want to thank you very, very much for having us all on the panel and look forward to the rest of the day. And so there's a break after us, but I'll leave that to our maitre d'.
So thank you so much, Jeff, for moderating, and panelists for your sort of really generosity of time and wealth of insights. As you can see from the many questions that I myself posed in chat, I was enjoying the conversation greatly. We're going to have a 15-minute break, and we'll be back at 2:30 Eastern time with studying social media platforms. Again, you can stay in this Zoom room or on this YouTube channel, and we'll just come back here and we'll put up a waiting slide shortly. So thank you again, and I hope to see everyone in 15 minutes.
Thank you, panelists.
Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to get started on our second panel on studying social media platforms. Sort of welcome back to everyone who was here for the first hour, and then welcome to folks who are joining us for the first time today. We had a really great discussion. We're looking forward to building sort of on this conversation around sort of covering, studying, and then finally after this, regulating social media platforms. This panel was put together by us here at CSMAP. This is sort of bread and butter. Welcome back. We're going to get started on our second panel on studying social media platforms. Oh, cool. Sorry, I heard some reverberation. This panel is being moderated by Josh Tucker. I'll turn it over to him for some brief intros and to give some framing around what we're going to discuss here.
Great, thanks so much, Steve. And that was totally my fault, the reverberation. So I will own that as I was trying to monitor the YouTube streaming of it as well and didn't mute it. Anyway, so thank you all for joining us again here. We have a fantastic panel for you today. What we're going to do in the second of our three panels today is to try to talk about questions around researching social media. Again, our event here is inspired by the release of the Facebook papers and sort of what researchers can be doing here. And in particular, what we want to talk about, building off of the end of at the end of the last panel very nicely, is the question of what data should be made available to researchers, how it should be made available to researchers, and in a sense, why it should be made available to researchers as well. We've got a great set of panelists here today to talk about different experiences around this question of data access for research. But I want to just address, before we go to our panelists, just address one of the issues that very much following after the panel before with journalism and covering social media platforms, the kind of elephant in the room anytime we talk about data access, which is the question of user privacy. So we had a lot of talk about user privacy before in the previous panel. We're going to have talk about user privacy in the regulating panel following. Jo, who's going to be one of our panelists today, has an event on Friday, which I'm sure she'll plug, where we'll talk more about questions about data privacy as well. But this panel is going to be we're going to focus a little bit more on the question of the data itself. And just to address that elephant in the room a little bit, I want to just share with you kind of how I think a little bit about this question. And then maybe we'll bracket it for the most part, although the panelists are welcome to come back to it in any parts of the discussion here today. Clearly, privacy of people's data online is a good. It is an absolute good for society. It's a good for everyone, and we would all agree that. And I don't think there's anyone. I mean, maybe there'd be someone who would argue with it, but most people are not going to say that there's anything wrong with people saying that people's online data should be private and privacy should be valued. However, we have to think about this in the larger context of what else is good for society. And another thing that's good for society is what's brought us all here today, which is thinking about how we hold platforms accountable, but also how we understand the impact of platforms on society. And one extreme of the data privacy, which would be to say data that is collected by platforms should never be shared with anyone who doesn't work for those platforms, that ends up being much more harmful for the question of us as a society trying to understand what the impact of these platforms are on society. So the way that I've sort of pushed this is to try to one way to think about this is that these are both important goods in society. We want a society that understands what's happening at these platforms. We want to live in a society where we understand the impact of what's happening in these platforms on things we care about in society, and we want to protect user privacy. And so we often need to sort of think about this in terms of these are two goods, and how can we maximize both of them, right? And how can we think about both of them concurrently with each other? And I think it's dangerous to think about one without thinking about the other. And that goes for data access as well, and for understanding social impact on the platforms. So with that in mind, I just wanted to sort of address that. Our panelists are welcome to come back to those questions within here. But today, in this particular panel, we're going to focus a little bit more on the data. And we want to take advantage of the specialties of our panelists here. And in particular, we want to think a little bit about different models by which data can be made available. I've heard, one of the people I've talked to about this and heard speak about this a number of times recently is Brandon Silverman, who was the founder of CrowdTangle that was brought up in the first panel here before. And Brandon has talked about a pyramid model where there is some data that would be available to everybody at high levels of aggregation. Then there'd be a second, maybe a second level of data that's available at slightly lower levels of aggregation that might be available to people as was being discussed in the panel, anyone who kind of wanted to do research and had the tools to be able to sort of access that. And then you could think about, much broader, much, wider data at much lower levels of disaggregation available to a more limited set of essentially researchers who are able to be vetted by doing things like going through IRBs and getting, and being legally indemnified through their positions at universities or similar type structures. So that's sort of one model that's been talked about. Another model that's been talked about quite a bit is the idea of third-party institutes, like building up institutions that would exist. And again, referring back to the previous panel here before, where we were talking about, making sure that everyone had access to data who wants to do research, who's able to do research for it, but not wanting to rely on the platforms to make the decision about who gets access to data and what data is made accessible. So the idea of coming up with kind of third-party institutes that would manage this and would sort of exist in the space between researchers and the platforms. There's also been talk about government-run depositories along the lines that we've seen, like for the census or quasi-government-run depositories, and things the way census data is acts. So that's what we want to talk about here on the panel today. We want to try to get a sense from here about what are the opportunities here. It does say, as was brought up at the beginning by Zeev, and sort of our motivation for holding this entire seminar or set of event here today was the renewed attention that came to this question of understanding the platform's impact on societies and the important role in that data access to people who are outside of the platforms will play in that in the aftermath of the release of the Facebook paper. So at this moment, where we suddenly have legislative attention on this in the United States, and I know Rebecca will talk about the attention that's been for a much longer time in Europe. And of course, as was talked about in the previous thing, we don't want to limit our discussion only to the United States and Europe, but to the extent that a number of these platforms are based in the United States, that we have a moment of opportunity here, we wanted to bring this, bring this part of the discussion to light here. So to paraphrase Jeff's question from the tail end of the previous panel, what I'm going to be asking the panelists to talk about here is, what data should be made available to researchers? How should that data be made available to researchers as well? And if they want to talk about why, all the more willing to do that. So we have a great set of panelists, all with different experiences that are relevant to different parts of these questions. And I've asked them each to kick off the discussion by taking some time to talk about their relevant experience, how they've thought about these particular questions. And then we'll follow that up with fire questions. But I'm going to give each of the panelists a chance to address this broad-based question to start off. So our first panelists, and I'll introduce each of them. I think I'll introduce each of them in turn so we can have a more free-flowing conversation after. I'll introduce each of them right now very briefly. You can find more about their biographies online through the CSMAP website for this event. So we're going to hear first from David Rothschild, who's an economist at Microsoft Research. He'll be followed by Josephine Lakido, who's an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin School of Journalism and Media in the Moody College of Communication. Be followed by Pablo, I'm going to go with the Polish pronunciation last name, Boczkowski, but is that right? Okay, all right. Pablo Boczkowski, who's the head of the Bin Khalifa Al Thani Professor, is the Hamad Bin Khalifa Al Thani Professor at Northwestern University Department of Communication Studies. And finally, Rebecca Trumbull, the director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics at George Washington University. So David, I'm going to pass it to you first.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming out today, and of course the organizers for this great event. And I'll give a little motivation for the type of work that we did. Is coming out of the 2016 election, coming out of the Brexit, we had a lot of questions about the general narrative about fake news and social media being pushed by algorithms, filtering to the general population, building out echo chambers. And we saw a big problem is that there was a lot of work being done to solve this, but not enough work at the time being done to even describe, is this real? If this is not real, what is the real problem? And then going back to that question of solving it. And so we went through the process of trying to get the data to really understand holistically what people's news experience was like. And the way we kind of went about this, and I would say that this is joint research with a bunch of different people, some internal at Microsoft, some externally, especially Duncan Watts, who's now at the University of Pennsylvania, is we started kind of a higher level thinking about absorption and impact of news. How well informed are people? And we say people, what people? Are we talking about the median American? Are we talking about the marginal people? How we describe various subpopulations, et cetera? And how does that affect their behavior? And we started answering some of these questions with various data sets, but then we got kind of drawn into kind of the lower level of that, which is what are they absorbing and how they impact it is based off what's being produced and what are they consuming. So on the simplest level, where are they consuming news? Who's making that news? And what is that news? And when we started breaking that down even further, we started saying, okay, we want to take a holistic look at that. Then we need to kind of understand what that could be. So we're thinking about television, radio, digital, social media, a subset of digital, and all of that's distribution channels. Okay, so these are ways people interact. They could be done in written form, audio, images, video. These are different types of medium. Regardless of the distribution, it could be created by providence from mainstream media, from elites, legal, political, academic, other regular man on the street. The style could be hard news or commentary or soft news. And there's all sorts of various types of publishers and article level ways to determine the quality of that. And so thinking about that taxonomy, all these various ways we can be thinking about news, what you kind of think about most of the research right now, and you realize that of the mediums, the potential mediums, you're really kind of focused in on written word. And even when we think about video, it's generally the transcripts coming from the video. So it's losing what's actually being seen on the screen, images. There's not as much work into what news is coming from images or audio. And provenance, a lot of the work is actually focused on links coming out. And this means we're kind of actually looking at the mainstream media element from it versus what people are actually creating on their own. Think about all the Twitter work that really focuses on the URLs and just ignores what's actually being organically created. I think when it comes to kind of the styles, people are just kind of mixing in news, and that could be hard news, it could be soft news, commentary, trying to understand these things. Definitely a focus on digital, focus on social media, and quality is generally focused on the publisher level rather than the article or segment level, and that leaves a lot on the table when it comes to variation in quality. And so kind of with all that in mind, what did we start building? Well, so we worked, and to Josh's point, trying to describing the different models, we worked in a couple of different ways. We had private-public partnerships, between us and various private companies to get us transcript data. So we worked with TVEyes per se, which is a company that collects transcript data off of TV. And we worked with a couple other companies to get transcript data on TV, transcript data from all of the various types of online news, as well as trying to build out transcripts of radio and various other types of mediums. We're missing a lot of work still on images and videos. The cost of holding videos has just constrained us, to be quite frank, even though we've had access to them. And then kind of much trickier, though, was building on the consumption side. We've been very fortunate to also make deals with various panel providers. So this is opt-in folks who've agreed to be tracked on their television consumption, some of their digital, mainly desktop. Mobile is much harder. And mobile, we've mainly been constrained to sometimes what apps people open, but very little as you see inside of the apps. And so desktop actually is a lot of the stuff you see in the research, and this is a big constraint, and there's some good work to try to handle some of that. We have limited amount of crossover. So we are seeing individuals, but rarely seeing individuals across various types of ways in which they get stuff, although we do have some limited. And then, of course, there's also aggregate data sets. And I'll talk briefly about Social Science One, although that maybe come up, and other types of attempts to get different data off of social media directly. And let me just revisit the motivation, just give a few high-level stuff that we see and where that's motivated future work and how we're moving. Number one is that even in social media, even when it's kind of biased towards it, but mainstream media is a huge actually provider of data, of content inside social media. And so it's a reminder that as much as we think of social media as this distinct thing, it's actually a really important aspect of it is actually still the mainstream media. That's actually changing a bit. Distribution, TV is still king. And so understanding people's overall, what they know about the world, it's important to still understand TV. Although as we move into social media again, that is starting to shift a little bit and people are doing more streaming. People demand stuff and we want to blame algorithms for a lot. This came up in the previous, I think it was Mike who came up with it, who talked about this point about not addressing the underlying problem. once you do see people's consumption across various types of modes, you see that it's highly correlated. And it's a really strong indication, there's other ones as well, that people are actually demanding various types of content. It's not the algorithms that are necessarily driving to unsuspecting people. And so it actually, the social media work there really shows that we need to address underlying problems as much as we need to address specific social media content in companies. I would say that, the median American consumes almost no news. And so as much as we talk about the general population, it's a big reminder that if you're concerned about the general population, you are concerned about no news. People are on social media. They are watching videos of other people playing video games. That is like the dominant thing people are doing. And they may get some news from that. Low quality online commentary is coming from that. Gamergate was brought up in the previous one as well. These are types of things they're getting. And that is very different than I think what people think of when they think of news consumption for people. But there are some populations that are heavily at risk. And this was also talked about in the last group. And we need to continue to focus at those groups. People who are being radicalized, people who are really getting hit by things. And the echo chamber literature also brought up in the last panel. It's super mixed, and it's not something that actually keeps me up at night as far as general population, but obviously with some very tight populations. Finally, I want to say at the end, what are the things we want from social media? Well, transparency, of course. Facebook made some things available, but to the other model that Josh was talking about, I'm a really big fan of kind of thinking through the census model. They spent a huge amount of money and time on the social science one, adding in noise, adding in various censoring to protect privacy, and ultimately led to a data set that costs a lot of money, and a lot of research was done on it, but there's not much results from it because essentially they made the data kind of useless by accident. And obviously experimentation also brought up in the last panel. And there's a great paper out today about how observational studies on Facebook on ad effectiveness, and not the same, but there's a lot about how earned media affects us, are just really bad compared to actual control studies. Facebook and other types of social media companies are constantly running tests, constantly running control studies. If they can get more access to people, it's important. And then finally, the last thing is these companies are advertising platforms that also have news on them. And it's just really important to remember in all these questions about regulations and how we deal with them, that they are playing all of us really hard to get ad dollars. And that's what they care about. And a lot of the regulations around privacy, a lot of the regulations and discussions around their effects, they actually use these to just close themselves off even more, create a more closed environment. They're building walled gardens for advertising. That is their end goal. And news is, they don't care about news at the end of the day. And so we got to be careful about how we approach it when the thing we care about a lot of the time is really just a side effect that they don't even really care about. All right, so I'll turn it back over.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much. Thanks, David. I really appreciate for kicking that off and for sharing us all the collection you've done. A lot of questions, but I'm going to go through around the panelists first. All right, so Joe, you're up next, and you have been doing that. Joe has been doing this. So David, they've done this incredible thing about building this layered data collections up in Microsoft Research. Joe, you've been trying to put together what's I guess what you're calling a data collective, or the Media and Democracy Data Cooperative. Would love to hear about that project, about what inspired it, what's going well, what you've learned from what you've been doing so far on it. So take it away, Joe. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. And to echo David, I just wanted to thank Josh and CSMAP for organizing this spectacular event. I think it's really, really critical. And as I'll kind of ramble on about, I think it's really critical for researchers to get together and actually talk through these things. Otherwise, we're all kind of working in silos. And so, as Josh alluded to, I organize what's called the Media and Democracy Data Cooperative. It's a cooperative of several research centers, including CSMAP, IDDP, the Center for Civic Renewal, as well as the Center for Media Engagement, which I'm a part of, and a couple of other universities. And we collectively work together to not only share and find ways to share data with one another, but to work on various research projects and to also discuss data ethics and protocol. And I really started this initiative because I was very tired of doing Twitter research. And like most folks, when I started doing social media research, Twitter was really the low-hanging fruit. They do a lot of work to make their data accessible, or as accessible as possible, to researchers. And I realized that there's only so much you can say with Twitter data, right? There's only 10% of Americans are on Twitter, and that's probably a generous assumption. And so I wanted to study these other social media platforms, and I didn't necessarily know how to do so at the time. And I realized that other people were collecting data and putting together protocols as well as scripts and code for how to do it. And in addition to wanting to learn how to do it, I wanted to collaborate with these researchers. And so my real impetus for starting the Media and Democracy Data Cooperative was to find ways for research centers to share data with one another and to make it accessible for folks to do cross-platform media research. We started this endeavor about 2 years ago, and since then we've learned a ton. We've had more universities join us, and the data cooperative as a whole rests on 2 pillars. The first pillar is making data accessible and talking through policies about how to ethically use this data, including how to get it through IRB. What do we do when we need to report the data? How do we de-anonymize information? That sort of logistical information that we don't necessarily get to put into our academic papers. And then the second thing the second pillar of this data cooperative is to provide research opportunities. And so a lot of the researchers who join us do work together and collaborate on research projects, particularly in the area of political communication. We do a lot of research related to political emails, QAnon, far-right movements, Black Lives Matter. There's quite a few projects that are ongoing. And it gives an opportunity for both early career scholars, junior scholars, as well as senior faculty to collaborate with one another. What I've found is that a lot of folks who are interested in the data cooperative, particularly this one, they join because they're really interested in the data, right? And so right now we have about 12 different data layers spanning a whole variety of social media platforms. We also collect news media content from mainstream and alternative news media sources, as well as starting to collect other non-media type content, such as FEC content. And so folks typically hear about the data cooperative and say, I want access to the data. But the reason why they actually stay with the data cooperative is the discussion. And so I always joke, you come for the data and you stay for the discussion. And that's because we do meet weekly to talk about various data ethics protocols. We talk about, when a research center wants to share data, how long should that data sharing relationship last? Should there be an endpoint? How should we think about data risk? Are people willing to work with perhaps scraped data versus data that was collected through an API? And these are, again, discussions that we don't typically have just because there's not enough space in academic papers, and otherwise we really only talk about them at conferences. And so one of the benefits, I think, of having a data cooperative like this is being able to discuss those sort of logistical things.
Joe, given that I've been just as guilty as possible, given that we have different audiences here from journalism, regulation, we've been asked in the chat, and I messed up answering it correctly. So could you explain what an IRB is and what an API is, just as you're giving this?
Yes.
Thanks.
So thank you so much. I really appreciate you reminding me of that. So an IRB is the Institutional Review Board. Each university typically has an institutional review board that assesses whether, if you are conducting research on human subjects, making sure that you are doing it ethically. And so a lot of research, typically with surveys and experiments, require you to go through IRB protocol or to get approval from IRB in order to conduct this research. Now, when social media came into being and when researchers started using social media data, there was this big question of whether it would have to go through an IRB protocol in order to analyze it. And I will say a lot of universities vary a lot, depending on whether IRBs consider it human subject research or whether they don't. And even within our own data cooperative, there's a lot of variance within our institutions. One thing I realized is that a lot of us don't know what the norms are in other institutions. And so IRB is typically not enough when it comes to talking about the ethics or the logistics of conducting social media research. So for example, one of the data sets that we've discussed but haven't necessarily collected includes a hacked data set of a social media platform called Gab. And my IRB technically let us use that data or collect that data, but ethically the researchers in my research center, myself included, are not willing to use that data because of the ethical considerations around using hacked data. And so what we realize is that IRB is useful, but they haven't necessarily thought through all of the logistical and ethical implications of using this sort of social media data. And this is where I think researchers who are actually conducting this work really play a critical role in creating that sort of protocol. And then what was the second term?
API.
So API stands for Application Programming Interface. It's one of the ways in which, if you are collecting data from social media, you can, social media platforms, some of them do make their data accessible through that Application Programming Interface API. And so it's a way for you to tap into a social media platform and either post content on that platform or collect content from that platform. There are a lot of different APIs, so this is a very overly simplified explanation. But if you are interested in this sort of work and how to collect social media data, a lot of folks do use APIs because typically when you access an API, it is with the permission of the social media platform. This differs greatly from data scraping and other strategies. So data scraping refers to essentially going to a website and pulling the content as is there. And most social media platforms are more okay with you using their official application programming interface or API, and they are less okay with you scraping their data directly from their webpage. And so some universities are more willing to use scraped data. Some universities are not willing to use that sort of scraped data. Just to kind of wrap up, because I know I'm limited in time, in terms of what's next, I'm really hoping that our data cooperative can start to, and we've been doing this, conducting research on multi-platform dynamics. So one of the things that we've become really interested in studying is migration of users. When a user is removed from one platform, do they migrate to another platform? Does activity on Parler or Gab spike after users have been removed on Twitter? And then the one thing I'd love to see more of, and if folks are looking for a research project, please feel free to reach out to me. I've become really interested in social media screenshots that move across different platforms, because I've realized that a lot of content from social media, like screenshots from Twitter, you'll see on Reddit, or Reddit content you'll see on Instagram, and vice versa. And this is a huge gap of literature that I've seen very little work on. And so if anyone's looking for a research project, feel free to take that one. And then finally, Josh alluded to an event that I'm organizing. So this Thursday and Friday, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. So this Thursday and Friday, I am organizing with my data cooperative the Digital Data Conference. And so on Thursday and Friday, we'll be talking about the same kind of things we're talking about here, the logistics of collecting digital data, including social and news media data, as well as the ethics behind it. So the ethics behind collecting that data, analyzing it, and then ultimately publishing and sharing that sort of data. And so if you're interested in continuing this conversation, I encourage you to join us. Rebecca Trumbull and Josh Tucker will be panelists on that day. And so we're very, very excited to have them, as well as a whole slew of other really, really excellent keynote speakers and panelists.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. We're going to turn next to Pablo. And Pablo, we're thrilled to have you here today. And one of the things that you've been thinking a lot about is trying to think about how social media can address inequality. And so on this question of what data do we need access to, and this follows very nicely on the first panel, where there was a lot of discussion in this regard about the way that, research agendas can be driven by the nature of the people doing the research, but they can also be driven, as Joe just said, we've all spent a lot of time studying Twitter data, by the nature of the data available. So in an effort to better address the study of inequality, are there specific things that we should be looking for in data? Your experiences trying to collect this kind of data, and then your thoughts as well about where we need to go in this regard and what data needs to be available. So thanks so much for being here, and looking forward to your thoughts.
Oh, thank you so much, Josh, for the invitation. Thank you to all the team for all the organization efforts, and thank you to David, Rebecca, and Joe. Pleasure to share the virtual stage with you. So to answer your question, what I want to do is to draw from a book that a collaborator and I, Mora Matassi, are publishing with MIT Press in spring. That takes a little bit of a 30,000 feet above the ground view of research on social media, and argues conceptually that, if we look at the bulk of research that has been done on social media, there have been a lot of very important insights produced, but most of the research has suffered from at least one of three critical limitations from a conceptual standpoint. The first one is that most of the studies have focused on single countries, and in particular countries in the global north. The global north is where about 13 to 14% of the world's population lives. So it's not only a small group of countries, a minority or in terms of where the population lives. Number one. Number two, as David alluded to in his presentation, the bulk of the research has studied social media divorced from the other elements of the media environment, broadcast, print, etc. And that has all kinds of limitations, because not only a lot of the content that we post on social media, we like, we share, etc. But a lot of our sensibilities, a lot of our aesthetic orientations come from our previous and concurrent media practices regarding television, regarding radio, and in some cases regarding print. And finally, and as Joe alluded to, the bulk of the studies have been on single platforms, one platform at a time, usually either Facebook or Twitter. There are a couple of dozen, more than a couple of dozen platforms with 100 million active users. So there are lots of other platforms to choose from. Not only that, as of the beginning of this calendar year, the people who were on social media, which is about 4.8 billion of the 7.8 billion who live in this planet, were during a 1 month on at least 7 media platforms, social media platforms on average. And what we post on one, in part, depends on what we post on the other. And the different platforms have very different cultures of use. So if we look at these 3 limitations, they're very different, but they have one thing in common. And what they have in common is that they don't compare. They don't compare, the research doesn't compare across countries or across regions, doesn't compare across social media platforms, and doesn't compare across media platforms, right? I mean, social media with traditional media. So if we actually start looking at the minority of the research that non-programmatically, but nonetheless in an ad hoc fashion, if you wish, has looked at least one of these comparisons, we start to see a lot of descriptive gains for sure, but also explanatory gains. And those explanatory gains point us to 2 other limitations, because they bring to the foreground a couple of topics that have not been studied a lot in social media research that go to your initial question, Josh, about what kind of data might we want, in particular regarding issues of inequality. Number one, a lot of the research focused on the present time. There's a strong present bias in the social media research. But if we look at the historical research on the history of technology, research on the history of media, research that has actually compared contemporary patterns with previous patterns, that important areas of continuity that highlight what is actually discontinuous about the present time. That's number one. Number two, and this is something that David touched upon, a lot of the research has an English language bias, right? And has a very strong textual signifier bias, whereby we know that we are looking at text and we are counting words, computational social science methods, or doing, more qualitative content analysis, etc. But a lot of the communication on social media has non-textual signifiers at the forefront, right? In particular, in some of the social media platforms that are gaining a lot more currency today. So if we add up all of these limitations, to answer to your question, what kind of data we need? We need data that cuts across multiple countries and multiple regions of the world, and that is comparative in nature, so that we can actually look at patterns that cut across these countries within the global north, global south, and differences within the global south as well. We need data that let us understand patterns across media. So I think, for instance, it's impossible to understand Facebook without understanding reality television. Right? Reality television prepared culturally the ground for sharing and for being absolutely fascinated with the life of the common person, as opposed to the natural world, as it was the case in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, or the lives of the elites. We also need data that cuts across multiple platforms, in particular, multiple platforms not from one single company, right? And multiple platforms not based in one single country, okay? We need data that cuts across multiple periods of time, be those periods decades, years, hours in the day even, right? Data that is temporally dynamic, that lets us understand the role of time in the social media experience. And we need data that goes beyond English, which is spoken by a minority of the people who live on this planet, right? And we need data that goes beyond just text, and data that look at the intersection between text and non-textual signifiers. With that, in just a few minutes, I wrap. Thank you for having me here.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. That was a lot of very a big picture, provocative ideas in a very short amount of time. I would imagine you're a very in demand speaker for these kinds of panels. So anyway, thanks so much, Pablo. Okay, finally, our last panelist who we're going to have lead in, and then we'll get into more of a discussion, open discussion, is Rebecca Tromble. And Rebecca, you have been doing so much in terms of thinking about data access in the context of the European Union. So it would be fantastic to hear a bit about your experiences there in what's going on with the European Union, a kind of update in terms of what's going on there, but also implications for what you think this tells us about what's likely to happen in the United States, or even more importantly, what should be happening in the United States. And then what are the opportunities as we finally get these research exemptions sorted out in Europe? What are the opportunities of the things that the previous panelists have talked about? Are any of these things coming in the pipeline? Are there things we should be looking for that are now going to be available? And conversely, are there things that are going to be off the table that are still important things that we may want to be able to study and analyze? So Rebecca?
Thank you, Josh. Thank you to everyone who put so much time and effort into organizing this today, and to my fellow panelists. This is such an important conversation, and I feel really privileged that I get to have it with all of you. Before I jump into answering the specific questions that Josh just asked me, I want to take a minute to take a step back just a little bit and offer a reminder that ultimately the access to data that we're asking for is data that in most instances has been gathered based on extractive practices, right? In the first instance, especially when we're talking about social media platforms and even data that's available from data brokers and so on, that these are extractive practices that are not grounded in consent, that at best are typically bordering on exploitative, but in many, if not most instances, are fully exploitative. Now, I personally believe that as long as these data are being collected, they should be put to social good. That actually we have to find ways for the users who these data are being collected from to benefit from that. But I personally would love nothing more than for the work that I'm doing right now to help expose precisely why these extractive practices are so problematic and to help shut them down. I guess I can say in short that long term, I'd like to work myself out of my own line of research into online harms. Now, with that said, right, I am doing quite a bit of work on data access for researchers in the US, but as Josh noted, particularly in the European Union. I am currently chair of a working group that's been established by the European Digital Media Observatory, multi-stakeholder group that's bringing together academic researchers, representatives from the platforms, as well as civil society organizations, to develop a code of conduct under Article 40 of GDPR to create a clear pathway for responsible, ethical, privacy protecting platform data access for researchers. We have finished our first draft of that code and are circulating it and getting feedback internally at the moment. And I'm hopeful that within roughly a month's time, we will have a public document to release that I think should be really instructive for helping move these conversations forward. But I can definitely talk about the broad conclusions that have come out of what is now more than a year's worth of work. Really in-depth, detailed, thoughtful discussions about precisely the issues that everyone else has touched on here today. Ultimately, what we are recommending, what the code of conduct will reflect, is a tiered approach. Josh referred at the very beginning to Brandon Silverman's pyramid approach. This is essentially along the lines of what we're thinking, but we categorize it, we use the term tiered approach. The first step of this approach is that we need to perform a basic risk assessment. And that risk assessment has to involve at least two core dimensions. One is the user's reasonable expectations for the use of their data. And so just to illustrate a little bit here, one of the things that we have to think about is the relative publicness right? But I want to be very clear that we cannot and should not, and GDPR also makes it clear that we cannot assume that public data, right, whenever somebody posts something on social media that is a public post, that then it is a free for all. We can do with it whatever we want. Absolutely not. We have to think about the user's reasonable expectations for the use of that data. And then crucially, a second dimension is that we have to think about the risks involved with the level of sensitivity that is in or could potentially be within the data. After performing a risk assessment, we can then think about 3 levels of overall risk. At the lowest level of risk, we would then see ultimately the fewest restrictions on how researchers can and should use the data and access it, safeguard it, store it, and so on. At the medium risk level, we are ultimately recommending access restricted APIs being the main mechanism for data access for research purposes. At the highest risk level, we're recommending the use of data clean rooms. And this is probably going to be most common for individual level data that is identifiable and involves sensitive content. But I want to be clear that this is not just for the platform data in the first instance. The code of conduct makes it clear that we also have to consider the products of the research itself. So when researchers are examining the data, processing it, analyzing it in various ways, including generating inferences that may be more sensitive than are actually in a sort of transparent way or at surface level way in the data, that increases the level of sensitivity, and then researchers must implement the same types of technical safeguards that we would require of platforms for that type of data. So those are, at a sort of very basic level, the 3 tiers that we're thinking about here. One really crucial thing to note that's become very, very clear in all of our discussions. And again, Josh sort of alluded to this a little bit in his opening remarks, but it's become very, very clear to the working group that we absolutely must have an independent third-party intermediary for these types of relationships between platforms and researchers. On the one hand, right, such an intermediary body could review researchers' proposals and the safeguards that they are proposing to implement. They could also, on the other hand, review platforms' data sets and the safeguards that they are proposing to implement, and crucially certify those things for each of the parties. Because one of the biggest issues that we see is that when platforms are given the right to review researchers' work, we have we run into lots of dangers that research independence will be undermined. It also can help us reduce inequalities across institutions that don't necessarily have the same level of resources to implement the sorts of safeguards that are required for research. And ultimately, we think that a third-party intermediary body should serve as a data repository itself, holding a lot of the critical data. And we're turning to existing models for this, including one in particular in France, the Secure Data Access Center, CASD is the French acronym. For those who are interested, that's definitely a body worth looking into more. We are now just days, at most weeks away from seeing the final language in the Digital Services Act in Europe, which is going to include Article 31 that actually mandates researcher access. We're probably roughly a month or so away from seeing language in Europe's Code of Practice on Disinformation about further mechanisms for researcher data access. And here we're not just talking about academics, but civil society organizations and even journalists. And so crucially, we need to have these safeguards laid out. I think the tiered approach is the best way to move forward. And I think that the lessons that we've now been learning in Europe can crucially be transferred pretty easily to the US environment, even without a GDPR existing, right? We can adopt codes of conduct if the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act moves forward. The same sorts of ethical duties, responsibilities, safeguards can be built into that legislation, whether or not we have something like the GDPR in the US. Basically, we can take the responsibility for protecting users' data privacy and other rights from the get-go, rather than waiting for, right, the US government to step in and do it for us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rebecca. I want to remind our panelists, or our audience, sorry, that you can leave questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen. So if you have questions you're interested in answering, our panelists have been doing a great job actually of answering the specific questions as they've come in. We can answer them live, but we can also put them into the discussion. All right, this has been fascinating, and I've already learned a ton from listening to all of you. I want to ask some follow-up questions. And my first follow-up question, I want to ask it to both David and to Joe, which is, so, I mean, and starting with David, like, so all this data that you've collected, what are the barriers that you have right now to making that data accessible to wider audiences? And to both of you, essentially, what are the key barriers you face in the kind of incredible data collection enterprises in which you've been involved, but also going forward, what would make it easier to do what you're doing, right? Is it legal and kind of regulatory changes along the lines of what Rebecca's talking about? Is it money? Is it that there's not enough funding in this space and that things need to be done? You know, we're talking about, and I'm going to go into this in more detail in a moment when I turn to Pablo and Rebecca, you know, but we're talking about equity in terms of access, right? In terms of making data more accessible, decreasing the barriers to entry. What would help the most in terms of the data collection efforts that you're doing in terms of making them making the accessibility wider? So are you facing legal constraints here? Are you facing academic norm constraints? Are you facing concerns about being data providers yourself? If you could just tell us a little bit more about, like, what are the major challenges that you face in what you're doing right now? And then, since we're kind of looking to the future and looking to our third regulatory panel, are there kind of changes to the regulatory environment? Are there changes to the funding environment and changes to training that could help us make this process to take advantage of all that you've done to make that data accessible to more researchers going forward? So David or Joe, whoever wants to go first, but I'd love to hear from both of you on this.
So I'll start off by saying that we have very high hopes and goals of being able to create a collective that we can share more data with. But the main constraint that we face now is that in order to speed and reach the types of things we wanted to do, in order to understand consumption of news, focusing first on that, we've worked with third-party providers that essentially have this as their business, tracking users in various capacities, and generally in an opt-in setting in which they're paying people a lot of money. And they have made research deals with us, which constrain our ability to share the data because they're concerned about cutting into their profits if research goes beyond very tightly defined research goals that could possibly be something they could charge other people for. And so the short of it is, to your point, it's money is the first box and answer. If I could go ahead and recreate panels and let people opt in and track people in various capacities in a privacy and forward thing, then we could definitely pull tons of people in, but we're talking tens of millions of dollars a year. Not the kind of money that any researcher has at their disposal or many researchers at their disposal. And there's completely funded by essentially marketing firms and advertising firms that are paying on the other end for this data. And so that is the main constraint that I see. Then there's a secondary constraint on privacy and security. Obviously, always mindful. You don't want to go too far away, especially when these companies are being fairly generous in the way that they're handling and supplying the data. And that also speaks to not just sharing, but also to issues involving publishing, which require replication and data access, especially on the individual level data. And those are things which I think we're in a very important transitory state in academia, as we want to ensure replicability, but we also need to make possible that research is done privately in codes made available, test data, but not the full data set. And so those two things have also weighed on us as far as building out as much sharing as we'd like.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, right? Because tens of millions of dollars is way beyond the budget of any sort of research that we've got going on in the social sciences. On the other hand, it's a pittance compared to the money that the government spends on, say, the National Institute of Health on an annual year. So it is an interesting question to think about, you know, the right reference points here in terms of what kind of funding is needed to do research that society deems is crucially important for the sort of health of the polity. Joe, turning to you, same question.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, it's not just money, but where the money is going. And so certainly with the data cooperative, a lot of the financial needs are for tech support and research infrastructure. And that's typically not what grant money goes towards, right? There's not necessarily an output for putting together an infrastructure that people can use to tap into data. And so certainly for us in the data cooperative, it's not just about the money, but specifically money allocated for building research infrastructure in a way that is accessible and responsible, right? And I love that Rebecca brought up the tiered approach as well as the pyramid approach. We take a very similar approach to our data. So some data are publicly accessible. FEC data is publicly accessible, and some data are much riskier and require some sort of data use agreements about what you're willing to share or what you can or cannot share. And in addition to that, there's not just the ethical considerations, but also terms of service considerations. So to use Twitter as a key example, we would love to make all of our Twitter data accessible to researchers, certainly by informal request. However, that would technically violate Twitter's terms of service because you can only share status IDs. Now, I've been in discussion with some folks over at Twitter about how to make certain parts of their API more accessible to researchers. One of the nice things that they've done for academics in particular is that they have actually put together a new downloader tool. This came out maybe 3 weeks ago. And it allows you, if you have academic track access, to collect Twitter data without the need to code, which I think is really cool, but again, is also purely limited to academics. And so I've been trying to push Twitter to figure out how to make tools like this more accessible to the public writ large. And that's something that I think researchers have to think about, right? That what is our relationship with social media companies, and what do we bring to the table when we talk to social media companies and ask for their data? One thing that I would love to see more of are events like this, and that's why I'm so glad that CSMAP is organizing this. I think in order for researchers to use data ethically and responsibly, as well as practically, we need to have discussions about what are the protocols behind this. We need to have discussions about what are the best ways to build research infrastructure, not only for our own researchers, but for collaborative work. And so these sort of events, I think, are really, really important and critical for advancing the field forward. And then I think those are all of the main things that I've been thinking about.
Just to quickly follow up with both of you. So neither of you went to sort of legal restrictions. So as best I'm hearing it, it's like the restrictions on sharing the data that you guys are collecting to do the kind of awesome research that you're doing here is from the companies that you're getting the data from, not from the idea that there's some inherent prohibition on it. So if all the companies change their policies tomorrow, it would be much easier to share this data across with different researchers. David, yes, Joe. Okay, great. Which is very interesting. All right, so Pablo and Rebecca, what I want to push you two on is actually very much what Rebecca, what you were engaging in, and also building off of our first panel, is a little bit on this question of the tension between the things that you're talking about being able to do better research, but then the ability to do that research being kind of limited, right? So Pablo, as I was listening to everything you were saying, my thought was like, yes, I agree. It should all be comparative. It should be multilingual, right? Like it should be across different time periods. But of course, doing some of these studies, like we did recently did a deactivation study in Bosnia, where we took people off of Facebook. Amazing research by Nela Ashamovic, who's one of the PhD students here at CSMAP. Single country study took up like a massive amount of effort in, over the course of one summer just to implement this. And then we did do it again in Cyprus, and that took a whole other summer to do it, right? But she had a lot of resources because she's working with the Center for Social Media and Politics to be able to do this. And so I wonder, are you concerned that or how are you thinking about this in terms of by raising the bar, and I'm again 100% agree with you, by raising the bar and then in terms of the necessity of doing this comparatively, is this something that we can think about as doing it comparatively as a field, in the sense that we should be pushing different people to be working in different areas? Or are we really talking, as you said, we have so many single platform studies. We really want to see platform studies across multiple platforms. But again, that makes the barriers to entry to doing that kind of research higher. And then Rebecca, the same thing, just to push you a little bit on the, if we go with the highest level limitations are these kind of secure rooms, what does that mean in terms of equity for access? And just from the starting point of like, are you really talking about actually secure rooms, like where you have to travel to Georgetown to use the room at Georgetown? Or are you, and I meant Georgetown because they have one of these data ones, not because I know you're at George Washington, but like Georgetown has one of these rooms for the census on it. I've seen it. Like you have to like go by, they had something like that there. And then, or are we thinking, is this something that can be done a la Fort, the Facebook open research tool, which is very highly limited who gets into it. It's a very safe and secure, but you could actually get into it physically from anywhere. And also, are you concerned in the pyramids, are you concerned at all about just, I don't know, I guess creating, how do we deal with that on the sort of high end data access? So either of you just like to think a little bit more about this tension between what is going to make, what makes research possible, but also this question of equity and access. So again, either one of you who wants to answer that first.
Pablo, I'll definitely let you go first, but I did just want to quickly thank Josh for walking back that very near slander of GW.
Yes, exactly.
Thanks.
Was really Roshan.
Thank you, Rebecca. In the interest of time, I'll say two things and try to be as provocative as possible. Number one, the limitations are culturally first and foremost. They are not material. There is a cultural predisposition when you are an empire, or when you've been, at the top of the game for many, many, many decades, to essentially default to your setting rather than to go see the world. As a matter of fact, in the global south, it's much less expensive to do research than in the global north. But it requires to sort of decenter yourself from language, from tradition, from rituals, and then to have that disposition to actually learn from the other. That's number one. So I think that the main limitations are cultural. Then there are all kinds of other logistical, practical limitations, number one. Number two, I wanted to make a provocative contribution, perhaps provocative, perhaps not. I am a theoretician by night, but my day job is as an ethnographer. And for the past 15 years, I've been doing ethnography of media consumers and media consumption. And I think a lot of the discussion has a very, very narrow view of what data mean and what kinds of data we need to understand social media practices. And there are lots of questions that cannot be answered by trace data. There are lots of insights that only come from talking to people, from hearing their stories, and maybe, perhaps, depending on the setting, from observing them. And in those cases, the limitations are completely different from the limitations we've been discussing. And it would be very, very important at the same time that we talk about building these repositories and all of this important work with trace data, that we do not forget that we cannot infer a lot of things correctly from just trace data about consumer experience, user behavior, citizen practices, etc. So I think it would be important to bring that to the conversation because the concerns are completely different. And there are also all kinds of different privacy issues, etc., that we need to be addressing. My 2 cents. Thank you again.
Okay, so Josh, to get to a couple of the really specific things you asked, when I'm thinking about talking about these data clean room environments, it's first and foremost a digital environment like the Facebook Open Research Transparency environment that you mentioned a minute ago, and primarily because those are more accessible than physical data clean rooms. But crucially, one of the things that is built into the code of conduct draft at the moment, we'll see if it stays in there as we go through the revisions, but is acknowledgement that, especially on the researcher side, if you're talking about holding, storing, or even generating high-risk data, the same sort of technical requirements that are necessary for safeguarding that data from the platforms are also necessary on the researcher's side. And that's going to be very difficult for a number of institutions to implement. And so we actually point to the fact that in those instances, it might actually be easier and better to think about that as a physical clean room environment rather than the digital one. So we want to build in some flexibility into these requirements so that we really can balance the essential rights and needs of the users against the kind of burdens and barriers that we're imposing on the researchers. One of the reasons that I pointed to the need for this intermediary body, and I really just touched on it very briefly in my opening remarks, is the ability for such a body to help reduce inequalities. It will never eliminate these inequalities. But when we're talking about, in Europe, for example, right, there is no requirement like there is in the US at the either the member state level or EU-wide level for ethical review of research. And IRBs, right, which Joe explained so nicely for us a few minutes ago, don't exist at a lot of European institutions. So under GDPR, really researchers should be undergoing ethical review, but they don't have these sorts of bodies that exist at their own institutions. So if we can, to some degree, pool resources to help researchers with these sorts of issues, I think that we can help to reduce inequalities overall. But there is just no getting around the fact that we have to accept some trade-offs in order to ensure the fundamental rights of the data subjects upon whose data our research ultimately relies.
Great, thanks so much. And that's a great point about the sort of, and I hadn't thought of it that way, about these safe rooms actually solving a problem of equitable access, which is excellent. And I think, and I'm very much with you that like any one of these third-party institutes that we think about solving these functions, serving these functions, like also providing the technical know-how and also providing guidelines to make on-ramps easier is a really valuable part of that, right? If it's just data, but you have to know how to manipulate a JSON file, that's valuable, but it's different from its data where there's ways to get involved with it. I want to turn now to the question Q&A and again, encourage our audience if there are questions to ask them. So Alex Hanna writes, and I know everyone, the panelists are doing such a good job of answering the questions first. I don't have as big a thing, but I'm going to put this out to everybody. And maybe Rebecca, you can share what you were saying, what you had said in the back to Alex. But Alex Hanna writes, something that my collaborators, my students, and I have struggled with regard to ensuring privacy for individuals. How do you balance, say, exposing and holding to account individuals who are perpetrators of harm versus individuals who are being harassed online and/or a part of a marginalized group? Okay. And/or a marginalized. All right, never mind. Yeah, actually, no, we're not. We're going to answer this question. Sorry, I lost track of time. This is going to be our last question, but I'm going to ask you to answer this. And/or part of a marginalized group. Currently struggling with this regarding how we analyze social media data from Black protesters versus pro-police people in the U.S. and members of the Tigrayan ethnic minority in Eritrea and Ethiopia versus government trolls. I'm curious how that plays into risk assessment framework that Rebecca's been working on. Also happy to hear from other folks as well. And I'm going to ask Rebecca if you want to take a shot at answering this, maybe to answer it, but we're going to wrap up within 5 minutes so we can get everybody a coffee break.
Yeah, really quickly, because I did answer this in writing. The framework that I mentioned before, right, has these two dimensions. One are the reasonable expectations of the data user. And I think that it is entirely reasonable and appropriate that thinking about that dimension of the risk assessment takes into account what type of user we're talking about here. The reasonable expectations for a member of a marginalized community, for a target of harassment and other forms of online harms are fundamentally different than the reasonable expectations of trolls. Second, when I mentioned the dimension of data sensitivity, that was sort of a simplification because under GDPR, really what that framework points to are the fundamental rights of the data subjects themselves. And so really that dimension is using, as I described it here, sensitivity is a proxy for that bigger question. And when we consider that dimension, certainly we can take into account who are the vulnerable populations here, right? How is a data user from one group, a data subject from one group, different? What are the risks to their fundamental rights versus other groups? And I think that we can, though it's not perfect, get to answers to the sort of underlying problem that Alex, you've been wrestling with.
Joe, do you want to maybe, just because you guys are thinking about this a lot, these kind of things at the Data Collective a lot, do you have anything you want to add on that?
I know we're coming up on time, so I'll just kind of ditto what Rebecca said. I think she put it really, really succinctly and really, really well.
All right, and I'll put in another plug for the event Joe's running. On Friday, we're going to return with a panel on data ethics that 3 of us here are going to be participating there, so we can continue that conversation there as well. Okay, so I want to take this moment to once again thank my panelists. The conference, it was so interesting that I was sure we had another 15 minutes left because there was no way an hour and 15 minutes could have gone by already. Thank you guys so much for joining me for this conversation. Thanks to our audience for being here. I think this panel really nicely complemented what we were talking about with the journalists in the first panel, and that was the whole idea behind the idea today. And I think we've also seeded some questions for thinking about in terms of the regulation panel, and hopefully there will be discussions there around data access as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ziv for instructions on what comes next at our little mini conference here today.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And just a quick reminder that we're going to stay in this same Zoom room or on the same YouTube channel, depending on how you're zooming in. And we'll be back in 10 minutes at 3:45 Eastern for our final panel. So see everyone soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, great. Welcome back for everyone who's joined us for our previous panels, and welcome to folks who are joining us for the first time. Really excited for our third and final panel of the day. We've discussed covering social media platforms, studying social media platforms, and finally, we're going to be discussing regulating social media platforms. This panel was organized by our friends at the Engelbert Center on Innovation, Law, and Policy at the NYU School of Law. And it includes sort of experts from the NYU Information Law Institute. So I'll turn things over to our moderator, Stav, who will both moderate the panel and also provide a little bit of framing for the conversation. So really excited to hear all of your insights.
Okay, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As you've said, this panel has been organized by the Engelbert Center at NYU Law and by the Information Law Institute, of which I think all the panel members are a part of. So we'll get started. We're still waiting for one more panel member who will be hopefully joining us very soon. So my name is Stav Zeytouni. I'm a doctoral candidate at NYU Law. I'm also a member of the Information Law Institute. Maybe we'll go around and have people introduce themselves, and then I'll kind of provide a bit of a framing for how this session is going to proceed. So Tomer, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Tomer Kenep. I'm a JSD candidate or doctoral candidate here at the law school. I study with Stav. I'll present my paper later, so I'll shut up now.
Aniket?
Hi, everyone. My name is Aniket. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the ILI.
And Alexandre?
Yes, good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Alexandre Destrel. I am a Hauser Fellow at NYU Law this year and mostly a professor of EU law in Europe.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So the notion of regulation in the social media space is something that has been kind of taking more and more space in a lot of law faculties and in legislatures around the world in the last few years. And in an hour, we couldn't possibly tackle all that there's to say about the regulations or the regulatory regime. So we've chosen to focus in this panel specifically about the challenges of regulating misinformation, with a particular emphasis on COVID misinformation. And we'll take that kind of case study as an opportunity to examine both the European approach and the American approach, and then try to think a little bit through where the regulation is going in both of these places and whether there are places where it converges. So we'll start with Aniket presenting a little bit of his research on COVID misinformation and anti-Asian hate speech on social media platforms. That will give us kind of a more empirical basis and maybe like a foundation of how lawyers or law people in general tend to look at social media empirically when they're trying to think about regulatory issues. From there, we'll proceed to Ira and Tomer's presentation on the challenges of regulating or moderating COVID misinformation, more from the American perspective. And then finally, we'll go to Alexandre, who will give us a little bit of his insights on the EU approach to content regulation and also potential convergences through platform moderation between the American and the EU approach. And of course, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll try to integrate them throughout. So having said that, I'm gonna ask Aniket to tell us a little bit about his research about COVID misinformation and how that shows up on social media platforms.
Great, thanks, Stav. So I have some slides that I'll kick us off with. Can you all see that? Okay, perfect. So I'll try to be brief. So yeah, misinformation and hate speech, the case of anti-Asian hate speech during COVID-19 pandemic. So this is work that was just published in the Journal of Trust and Safety, along with my colleague, Jae-Yeon Kim. Basically what we kind of wanted to investigate here was this first part of the title, this kind of relationship between misinformation on social media platforms and hate speech. So we typically saw in both of our research that these two topics are usually treated separately in the literature. There's a big literature on misinformation. There's a big one on hate speech, but not so much that actually kind of connects the two concepts together. So in this project, we went ahead and took a look at a very particular instance. So on March 16th, 2020, former President Trump called the COVID-19 virus the Chinese virus. And I'll show you a tweet in a second showing exactly how he did that. And a lot of people have documented that since the beginning of the pandemic, there's been a rise in anti-Asian violence, particularly in the US, anti-Asian violence and sentiment. And we were in particular interested in looking at what was this relationship between the misinformation that Trump had kind of put out into the world and the way that hate speech speakers were kind of interacting with the social media platform. So we could take a second, I apologize, it's a little blurry there, but we could take a look at the tweet that kind of kicked all of this off. So Trump said the United States will be powerfully supporting those industries like airlines and others that are particularly affected by the Chinese virus. So at this point, he wasn't calling it COVID-19 yet. And he doubled down on this language later on the same day in a speech outlining the administration's kind of broad response to the virus. And again, continued to refer to it and in terms like the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, the Kung flu, etc., for several months through the pandemic. So we investigated two hypotheses. One, that his tweet was associated with an uptick in both anti-Asian hate speech, but also counter hate speech, basically just kind of increasing the amount of engagement with this idea, sort of on both sides here. And then the second hypothesis, both before and after Trump's speech, we hypothesized that hate speech speakers shared misinformation regarding the role of the Chinese government in the origin and spread of COVID-19. But this tendency was amplified after the tweeting period. The basic idea there is that there was already quite a bit of anti-Asian hate speech going on Twitter in the months preceding this tweet, but we wanted to investigate whether the introduction of misinformation was going to make a difference in how people were speaking. Okay, so we used a data set that was approximately 2 million tweets collected from Twitter and labeled, part of it, most of it machine labeled, as to whether the tweets contain hate speech or counter hate speech. So hate speech being speech that targets particular groups, counter hate speech being that which attempts to fight against certain stereotypes or fight against hate speech by downplaying it somehow. So we asked, did the linguistic context around the term Chinese virus change before and after Trump's tweet? And we use a method called embedding regression. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to get into methodology, but if we have time in the Q&A, I'm more than happy to discuss it at length. But really, really simply, the empirical thing that we were looking for is whether the way the word Chinese virus was used before and after this tweet substantially changed. And the way we measure that idea is by looking at the words that are most closely associated with it. So just really quickly, what we did was we built this on top. What embedding regression does is built on top of word embedding. So for those of you unfamiliar with it, it does what I basically just said, of trying to understand the linguistic context of a word by basically applying a deep learning model to understand how different words are related to one another. So this is so the reason that this is helpful in natural language processing is that it helps us understand kind of relational concepts between particular phrases and words. One limitation of the kind of word embedding approach until more recently was that it wasn't always well suited to inference. So if we wanted to learn something about the way word itself changed over time, word embeddings by themselves wouldn't necessarily get you there. So we use a new method that was introduced by Arthur Sperling and colleagues about last year that places that method in a regression framework. So you can see what the math looks like and everything. I'm not going to get too far into it, but the main thing that we were trying to do was estimate how did the context around the word Chinese virus change before and after the tweet, as well as was that context different in the way that both hate speech speakers and counter hate speech speakers use the term. So we got a couple of preliminary, a couple of results here. So one was that hate speech did increase after Trump's tweet, but so did counter hate speech. So this is something that we think was kind of underexplored in both the media coverage and the literature. Immediately following that tweet, there was a lot of attention paid to the increase in hate speech, as well as the increase in hate crimes following Trump's tweet and following just the general rhetoric of that time. But there was also a kind of increase in counter hate speech. A lot of people were also fighting against the use of these kinds of harmful stereotypes at the same time. So we could see that both there was kind of hate and counter hate speech before the tweet, and the kind of days and weeks immediately after, we see a spike in both. There is still more hate speech going on in this data set after that tweet, but we do see a rise in both the hate and counter hate speech, suggesting there is a discourse here, not simply working just on hate speech. Then this is going to be our main results. I'll zoom in slightly. So again, without getting into how the method works exactly, the main thing that I want you to kind of get out of this is that on this left-hand panel, what's showing up here is going to be the word vectors, or the words that are most closely related to our keyword Chinese virus. And we have it shaded by hate speech and counter hate speech. So you see before the tweet, words like MSNBC or CNN were among the top words, the most closely associated words with Chinese virus. And we see that particularly with hate speakers themselves. After Trump's tweet, we see a big change where we see phrases like China lied, people died, Chinese bioterrorism, Chinese virus corona, wet markets, hold China accountable, changed to become among the most closely associated words with hate speakers especially, but also among our counter hate speakers. And the main takeaway here for us is that what we noticed was that this linguistic shift suggested that people who were engaging in hate speech were shifting their strategy from when talking about the Chinese virus, when referring to COVID as such. They shifted their strategy such that they made use of the kind of misinformation. They realized they couldn't be so kind of outwardly racist, but instead couched a lot of what they were saying in criticisms of the Chinese government itself, saying China lied, people died. That was a hashtag that was trending as a way to lay blame for the COVID-19 pandemic on the Chinese government, really kind of couching their language in seemingly neutral criticisms of the Chinese government and the Communist Party. So for us, what this does is open up a kind of new area of research into how to think about these kinds of twin aspects of social media speech and regulation. Again, the main takeaway is that whereas before hate speech and misinformation were treated as kind of separate problems on social media, we found that hate speech speakers seem to be justify their hate speech by calling on misinformation, using misinformation to kind of justify racist views. So we hope to see more work into this kind of link between these two concepts. And for us, what we're doing is following up with a comparative study of how this worked in different countries, as well as field experiments kind of measuring the association between attitudes towards COVID-19 and attitudes towards the Chinese government. I think I got to exactly 10 minutes there, so I'll hand it off back to Stav. Thank you.
Thank you, Aniket. That was super informative. I think that also this kind of work really highlights the fact that for for a lot of people working in law circles, it's not only regulation is not only about just speech or it's about just privacy. It's really about trying to find a balance between all these different kinds of areas. And then you often find people who might be experts in speech law, but not necessarily experts in privacy law, and the kind of approaches that you get might be very different from experts in these different fields. And misinformation kind of throws us into a completely different ballgame, which kind of mixes a lot of these things up as well. So on that note, I see that Ira's joined us. I'll let him introduce himself. I'll let him introduce himself, and then Tomer and Ira will talk to us a little bit about the US approach and and how it kind of reacts to the challenges posed by misinformation on social platforms.
Hi, Stav. Thanks. Sorry for joining late. I'm Ira Rubenstein. I'm a senior fellow at the Information Law Institute. And Tomer and I have just nearly completed a paper on public health misinformation and how to deal with it, particularly under US law. So I'm going to just very briefly describe the paper, and then each of us will talk about two of the more important sections in it. So think back to the ivermectin controversy of about a year ago, when social media started promoting the use of that drug to treat COVID, even though it's really intended for treating parasites, particularly in animals. And it became a big phenomenon with lots of people experimenting with it, resulting in a very large number of prescriptions and calls to emergency lines because of problems that it caused. And all of this wouldn't be possible but for social media, with its ubiquity, the velocity at which it spreads information, its almost universal reach, and also just its capacity to spread misinformation by amplifying speech that's controversial, that's outrageous, using algorithmic targeting to achieve that goal, and doing that for business purposes. So that's just kind of one example of public health misinformation. And in our paper, we made a case study of COVID-19 misinformation. And the paper is organized into a couple different parts. First, we begin by talking about the extent of the problem and the harms that public misinformation causes. Then we look at what platforms have done to date to address it. I'd say we'd give them a grade of about B. They did a pretty decent job, but they were a little bit slow in offering a really comprehensive approach. Facebook's a particularly good example of this. On the one hand, Mark Zuckerberg, whose wife is a doctor and who's very science-oriented, made it a priority as CEO of Facebook to do something about COVID-19 misinformation, and he failed. And he failed because of two things, I think. One is that there were like surprising gaps in what Facebook did to address this. It failed to realize that a lot of the misinformation was being spread through comments, and that its content moderation software didn't look at comments. A lot of it was being spread through private groups, which it wasn't really monitoring. But I think most importantly, there was a tension between addressing misinformation and the underlying business model of Facebook and the other major social platforms, all of which profit from amplifying this outrageous, excitable kind of speech that gets people to stay online, to see more ads, to spend more time and make more money for the company, along with maybe a lack of transparency over what the companies were really doing. They'd kind of highlight their success stories, but you'd get like a numerator, but never a denominator. So you never really knew how successful this was. The paper then turns to possibilities for government enforcement through liability regimes. We look at consumer protection law, medical malpractice law, and also the tort system to see if any of those are really effective in addressing the spread of misinformation. And we find that they're all too narrowly focused to really do a good job, apart from dealing with either commercial actors or professionals. And then as to platforms, of course, there's Section 230, which immunizes platforms against a liability for user-generated content, which is really the source of the problem. So the paper concludes with two sections. One is a look at what else governments can do, not in the realm of enforcement or liability so much, but more what's called soft law. So, public-private partnerships, voluntary cooperation, self-regulation, and those sorts of things. And Tomer's going to talk about that in a minute. And then we also finally examined some reform proposals that have been put forward in Congress, all of which are thought to raise severe First Amendment issues. And we take a stance on that issue as well, which I'll come back and address after Tomer speaks.
So I'll jump in right here. Thanks, Ira, and thanks, Tao, for moderating this. Finding that that public health misinformation is such a big deal and such a problem socially, and then finding that only platforms are able to do something about it, and they are not even successful, was kind of a downer. So we set out to find and to think what other things governments can do. And in the US perspective, there is quite there are quite severe limitations on on hardcore regulation. So legislating against misinformation. So something like you cannot spread misinformation or you will go to jail. This kind of thing will not fly. However, soft regulation is possible. So what do we mean by soft regulation? So one kind of soft regulation that we have in mind is something like government speech. So whenever government goes out with public ads saying, hey, you should wear your mask, whether they do it on social media or somewhere else, this is a section of governmental activity that is called government speech. It is protected under First Amendment doctrine, which means that government in the US can do it as it likes. And research suggests that this sort of counter speech is extremely helpful in actually curbing the spread of COVID-19, or more specifically, the influence of COVID-19. So even if you have a lot of public health misinformation out there, when you have an authoritative source like the government, like the CDC or the FDA, that goes on to the social media platforms where this public health misinformation is spread and give out a laid out response of what are actually the facts, this seems to be very helpful in stopping people from making reckless choices. So this is one sort of soft regulation that we have in mind. Two other forms of soft regulation that we have in mind have not really been used in the US, but are quite, we can see them in other places around the world. So one of them is what we call soft regulation. So it's basically the use of codes or codes of conduct. So the EU, the European Union is really strong on that. The general point is the following. The regulator, be it the government or a specific agency in the government, sets up the code of conduct for platforms, expecting them to do something about the topic which they want to regulate. So let's say the EU, for instance, has developed a code of conduct for misinformation more generally, and it requires. And this code basically requires the platforms to dilute the visibility of misinformation, to work against the monetization of misinformation, and all of this kind of stuff that could help identifying and demoting misinformation on these sites. Now, after they publish this sort of codes, they invite the platforms or private entities to come in and sign in voluntarily to this code. So there is no real strong enforcement mechanism, just something kind of soft. And yet there is some sort of sword at the other end, because once they sign up to the code, the platforms are required to do quite a lot of monitoring and reporting on what they are actually doing in order to promote the goal. So for mechanisms to confront misinformation. And this turns out to be quite successful in guiding platforms to develop the kind of regulation that we actually want them to develop in order to confront the kind of issues that we want them to confront. So we have on one side the government or governments being able to nudge platforms to develop the desired policies. And on the other hand, you have the government being able to nudge the platforms to apply these policies, right? So you have all sorts of mechanisms in which specific government actors are establishing direct connections to the platforms and telling them, listen, this is, we identified this a lot of misinformation coming from one source or another source. We ask you to remove this kind of speech. Now, this might seem minute and not very important, but it is at least a very strong signal that the governments are sending to the platforms regarding whether the platforms should direct their enforcement mechanisms, which again seems to be, appears to be very successful in other realms of regulating speech online. So these are just a couple of softer regulatory measures that basically any government can make, even in the US, without instigating all sorts of First Amendment issues. And yet we might want to try to push back against those more stringent issues, and Ira is going to talk a bit about that.
Thanks, Tomer. So the soft law approach is really significant, we think, because it can be done, badly or well, and doing it well can be quite effective. But that said, the question still arises, why regulate? And I think the answer is that these soft law approaches, the more, cooperative approach, is inevitably a function of platforms voluntarily taking steps. Those voluntary steps may be incomplete, and they're always reversible. So we'll see a lot of activity around a crisis like COVID or a crisis like the January 6th insurrection, and then it starts to fade. Whereas, regulation, once it's on the books, it has an ongoing effect. So we make a somewhat novel argument regarding the First Amendment implications of regulating what we call algorithmic amplification, which is this whole notion of the platforms using personal data about their millions and billions of users to target content at them with the knowledge that that content is going to be perceived by them as relevant, as interesting, as exciting. It'll keep them engaged and on the platform. And to understand this novel argument, I need to spend just a minute on the most basic of all First Amendment doctrines, which is the idea that content-based restrictions are subject to the highest level of scrutiny, called strict scrutiny. And that's a standard that's very difficult to satisfy. So if government were to try to regulate social media, and I've seen proposals like this coming out of the Congress, and they're really idiotic, by passing a law that says social media platforms have to only allow politically neutral statements. Well, that's just blatantly unconstitutional, because it would put the government in the position of having to decide what counts as politically neutral. And there's no more controversial topic than that. And you can only imagine what would happen if certain administrations had the power to enforce that vague standard. In contrast with content-based restrictions are what are called content neutral restrictions. And the favorite example of that are time, manner, and place restrictions. So a city might have rules saying you can hold public, protests or parades, but only in these locations and only at this time of day, and only if loudspeakers are kept below a certain volume. And those are judged under a lower standard called intermediate scrutiny, and they're often upheld. But if the same type of regulation said, but you can't hold labor protests, or you can't hold protests in front of abortion clinics, those would be struck down, because now you're getting into the realm of content. So with that background in mind, the basic position we're taking is that at least some of the bills that have been put forward in Congress should be treated as content neutral and may in fact withstand scrutiny. And we don't really evaluate the bills themselves so much as just make the point that they need to be understood for what they are. And they're not content moderation bills. They're bills regulating algorithmic amplification. So one of these bills would modify Section 230, which I mentioned before, is the provision that shields platforms from liability for user-generated content. And what this bill would do is to eliminate Section 230 protection for platforms that use an algorithm, in the words of the bill, to rank, order, promote, recommend, amplify, or similarly alter the delivery of information. So the idea is that there's a way to deliver content that doesn't depend on this kind of algorithmic boosting that occurs, and that is arguably the chief cause of the problem on social media. And our basic argument is that that is not a provision that directs platforms to regulate content. There's a second bill that approaches this in a somewhat different way, but with the same basic kind of regulation in mind. And to try to make this point clear, the one thing I'll add is that it's easy to confuse two different things that go on when platforms amplify content. One is all of the major platforms engage in content moderation. They all have their own codes of conduct that they use to remove, hate speech and bullying and illegal speech that might involve terrorism or whatever the case may be. And to detect or discern that type of speech, they use algorithms that are trained to match or classify on the basis of content. And clearly, a bill trying to regulate that would run into First Amendment issues because it's by its very nature content-based. The other thing the platforms do, however, is they use algorithms to boost content, to make it more relevant, to get you more interested in viewing it. But they don't do that by means of content. They do that by means of looking at a bunch of other factors, most notably behavioral factors like how much time do you spend with this video? Did you click that you like this comment? Did you reply to the comment? Did the content come from somebody in your family or friend group? And none of that is really content-based. And we can elaborate more on this if we have time to go into detail, but that's really the heart of our argument, that bills regulating algorithms on the basis of amplification should not be confused with algorithmic methods for identifying content. They're in fact algorithmic methods for ranking content to make it relevant to users. And those can be regulated and subjected to content neutral standards rather than content-based standards, so that they may well in fact survive constitutional scrutiny. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomer. I think if there's kind of one thread that really runs through this in terms of also bridging this, your insights into what Alexandra will have to say to us in just a moment, is how central the notion of the First Amendment and free speech is for even starting to think about content moderation and regulation in the US. And I also kind of want to point out, because I think it's sometimes for us when we're situated at NYU in the US, how idiosyncratic the US's approaches to free speech and to hate speech in general, and how many limits it puts that I think for when you kind of get out of the US, those limits are just very different, and B, in certain places they don't come from the place of speech or free speech. So thank you so much for your presentation, and I'll let Alexandra now talk to us a little bit about the EU approach, which I think will have at least a few points of difference. Let's just put it that way. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Stav, and thanks to all the panelists before. So indeed, I mean, when we speak about fundamental right, depending of the jurisdiction, some fundamental rights are more fundamental than others, it seems. And so clearly, I think in the US, the free speech is the main fundamental right, where as you hinted, that's not the case in the EU, and maybe it's privacy, which is more fundamental than others, and that is raising another sets of problem. But I just wanted to say that 2022 will be really a shift year in Europe, because Europe is about to adopt two very important pieces of law, the Digital Markets Act, which relate to competition and contestability of market, which has been agreed last month, and this month normally the Digital Services Act, which is about content moderation, should also be agreed. And so I think those two pieces of law show a completely shift of paradigm in Europe regarding big tech. While big tech, before it was really left alone and could do more or less what they want, now the states or the European Union in this case is really taking back control of the cyberspace. And I think the independence of the cyberspace is really putting to an end this year in Europe. Now, how that is done, it's with a mix, as it has been said by Ira and Tomer, it's a mix of soft and hard law. Now, I'm a little bit less optimistic about soft law than you seems to be, or at least, as Ira said, it's very important how soft law is done, because most of the time self-regulation is self-serving. And so it's very important that I think self-regulation or co-regulation only work in the shadow of the law. And that's exactly what we see with the code of misinformation that Tomer mentioned. It works because the platform knows that if they don't make a lot of effort there, a regulation will come through. And as you know, European Union like to regulate. So, it's a kind of credible threat. So how the system of content moderation is organized in Europe, we will have a centerpiece, which is the Digital Services Act, which really relate to illegal content. And then you have a number of pieces which are a little bit stricter for the most harmful of the illegal content, terrorism content and child sexual abuse, with stricter rule there. And then for content which is legal but harmful, like COVID disinformation, for instance, or other type of speech, then you have at this stage only a co-regulation. Okay, so there is a kind of three-tier systems, very strict for harmful and illegal, in the middle for illegal, and then a co-regulation for something which is legal but harmful. Now, the centerpiece will be the medium part, so illegal content, and that is the Digital Services Act. And really there, you have four elements, I think, of the Digital Services Act, which, as I said, should be agreed this month and probably will enter into force and be applicable to the platform at the end of next year or early 2024, because there is a number of months for the implementation period. So the first element is the liability exemption. The equivalent is not the exact thing, but the equivalent of Section 230 will be maintained. And that's a very important point that was agreed very early on. I mean, that it's the liability exemption of the passive platform will be kept. But to, in a way, keep this liability exemption, they will have to do more than what they are doing now. And for every platform, big and small, they will have more transparency obligation, in particular in their term and condition, and they will have to publish annual report on what they are doing in terms of content moderation. And they will have a number of due diligence obligation, in particular regarding notice and take down actions. So they have to take speedily a notification of a user which is saying this content is legal, And then a number of out-of-court dispute resolution mechanisms we'll have to put in place, because we know that in general, the user don't go to court. And then there is a number of discussion, but that's not yet agreed on specific regulation and prohibition regarding dark pattern and regarding online ad for minors. But there is still discussion of how far those two elements will be regulated. And then for the biggest platform, because what is interesting in the Digital Services Act is that you have an asymmetry. So you have some rule which apply to everyone, and then a stricter rule which apply to what is called a very large online platform, basically the platform with more than 45 million monthly user, and they will be subject to enhanced transparency obligations. So if you want, the transparency obligation will be stricter for them, but also, and I think that is potentially an extremely powerful instrument, an ex-ante systemic risk assessment of their services. So, before they launch a new services, they will have to assess the risk on the number of human rights. And that is not very clear how it will be operationalized, but I think this is a real paradigm shift in the digital industry, because before, we were in a permissionless environment, and that will not anymore be the case. And they will also have to set up a compliance officer in their own company. So there will be much more compliance obligation, and there will be a number of data sharing obligation with not only the authority, but also with vetted researchers, so researchers which are vetted by the authority to help the oversight of the platform, because clearly this will be extremely complicated to enforce this new law, and so the authority alone will not be able to do that, and will need the help of researchers. But for those researchers to be useful, they need to get access to the data. And the last element is this aspect of enforcement. So for the small platform, it will be a public enforcement. As you may know, in Europe, we tend to favor public enforcement over private enforcement. Which is of course a difference with the US. But so in this case as well, the public enforcement will be quite developed, because every states of Europe will have to set up a national regulatory authority, which probably will be the existing media authority in most of the member states, which will have their competence extend to the platform. And that's also a very interesting and innovation. The biggest platform, so the big tech, will be regulated by the European Commission directly. So, the flow that we have seen in the GDPR, which is to say, is the Irish authority, the Irish Data Protection Authority, which has to do the job for all Europe, and clearly don't have the incentive nor the ability to do it. That's not this, I would say, a mistake. This mistake has not been repeated here. It will be the European Commission, which will be in charge of the very large online platform. So, much more a due diligence obligation and a better enforcement system than what we have now for other law applicable on big tech. Now, as I said, this is the main part of the system, but we have a stricter rule for terrorism content. That is a regulation which has been adopted last year. And for child abuse, a bill should be proposed by the Commission this year. The idea being that there, for instance, you will have time constraint to remove that type of content. And then for the legal but harmful content, like the one which was mentioning before by the case studies on COVID, misinformation, there you have indeed a code of practice which date back from 2018. But what is interesting with that code of practice, it was voluntarily signed by, as it has been said by Tomer, by a number of companies, and more companies have signed on this code of practice. But last year, the Commission adopted a communication saying, I want this code of practice to be changed in that and that direction. So formally, it is still the company which voluntarily also designed the code of practice. It was not drafted by the Commission, by the Commission, but let's say that the Commission give input, and a strong input, to say, okay, You have to do that, otherwise, basically, I will regulate. And what is interesting with this code of practice, it's a very interesting experiment of co-regulation, but which based itself on other previous experiment. We had a code of conduct for hate speech. Before we had a code of conduct for counterfeit goods as well. So, you know, there is a whole, let's say, a learning process since 10 years in Europe in the use of code of practice. And the two main learning that we got from that experiment is that first, it's very important that the rules are drafted by every stakeholder involved and not just by the big tech or the big platform, but every stakeholder involved and with strong input of the public authorities. And second, that there is a very close monitoring, which is done not only by the platform, but also by the public authority on whether the commitment taken in that code of conduct are respected. So, you know, it's really co-regulation in the shadow of the law. And I think it's only in that kind of circumstances that co-regulation could really work. Finally, the two questions for the future, once the DSA will be adopted, the first question, of course, is how effective it will be, because it is an extremely complex law. It is a new law. We know that we are talking about complex and evolving technologies, and that will require, and that's probably the most difficult element, that will require a change of culture within the company, you know. And in a way, you know, one possible evolution is that the big tech in particular will become like big bank, you know, being like the banking sector. So with a constant and deep oversight that is done by the supervisor or by the regulator on their activities, and in this case, their data and algorithm. And that is, of course, a completely shift of a completely cultural revolution for those firms. And that will be in particular difficult because, as it has been said in several previous panel and also in this panel, that may change or that may have some implication of on their business model. So, you know, when you have to change the business model and the culture of a company, that's quite of a challenge. The second element, of course, is we are talking about global platform, or at least platform which are active much beyond the European Union. And so the question is whether we will have a kind of regulatory convergence in what we are doing. And, you know, this regulatory convergence may happen in different manners. It may happen through states, or it may happen through markets. It may happen through states, and that's what, for instance, Anu Bradford in her book Brussels Effect would call the de jure Brussels effect. So we have the states agreeing, or agencies at least, agreeing on a similar approach. And what is interesting is that the US and the EU have set up this Trade and Technology Council last year, where there is a specific working group which is in charge on platform. And if you read the mandate of this group, it's mostly about three things: illegal and harmful content, algorithmic amplification, and access to data for researchers. So really around what we are discussing here, not much for the other issue of platform. So that's maybe one way where we get some convergence. And the other way, of course, is through market, what could be called de facto Brussels effect, where the platform will, let's say, extend what they are doing in Europe because they have to do it because of the DSA through other services across the world. And so the question is whether, even if some content moderation intervention are not possible in the US because of the First Amendment, whether in a way, through the European intervention, the US could leverage what is happening in Europe, in the US. Now, that's not clear at all, of course, because the platform may also decide to differentiate the service across jurisdiction, and probably it will be a mix of both. You know, in some case they will differentiate, in others they will it will be uniform. So it will be interesting to see. But I think, of course, that's a question to look at, and it's very important. I think if there is this kind of de facto Brussels effect, that the US authorities engage also a lot with the European authorities on the implementation of this law. Because, you know, one thing is to adopt a law, but that's really the easy part. The other thing is to implement that law, and that will be extremely complex. For instance, and I think the most complex piece in the DSA will be this systemic risk assessment that the platform will have to do before launching their services. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone. I think we really got kind of a broad range of regulatory approaches, from soft law to hard law, and what hard law means can really change across jurisdictions, I think, is what kind of this conversation is really bringing to the fore. And I think kind of following up on that insight, I mean, Alexandra, you talked about a possible convergence and a possible Brussels effect, which is something that would be more kind of an effective European influence on American companies' behavior and potentially on American regulation as a result of that. But I also want to ask also both Tomer and Ira, and also Aniket, who's been, I think, studying this. I think you've mostly focused on the American space in social media. But I also want to ask whether both a fragmentation can occur as a result of like two possibly different approaches that are also very dominant, and whether that would make it actually, well, I'm sure it would be more difficult for the companies themselves, but I also wonder if there's also a potential that, for example, if there's too big of a fragmentation, there will be an opposite effect from the Brussels effect, almost like it's not quite a California effect in the sense of the companies will say, well, we can't do both of these things at once. So we're either going, I mean, I don't think anyone's going to withdraw, but it will kind of force the European regulator to rethink the implementation of these regulations, if that's also a possibility. So there are a lot of questions kind of posed all at once. So maybe I'll start with Alexandra. You can answer that last question, and then I'll ask Tomer and Ira how they kind of see this kind of thing playing out.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question, and I think nobody knows, because it will depend of two things. First, what is the exact interpretation that will be given to those provisions? Because of course, the stricter the obligation will be, the more the incentive of the firm to differentiate or even to leave some market will be. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, I don't know how easy it will be to differentiate a different type of content moderation. But I guess that in any case, you will find some differentiation, because, you know, the heterogeneity of preference are so big, especially when we talk about content moderation, that I think inevitably we will not be able, US and the EU will not be able to agree on a common approach. And so inevitably you will have some differentiation. The debate regarding economic regulation and competition and contestability is a little bit different, because there, my impression is that there is more convergence of objective across China, the EU, and the US on trying to control the market power of those companies. But for content moderation, I mean, I think there the three main jurisdictions of the world are really divided.
Okay, thank you. Tomer or Ira, if you want to maybe react as well.
I can start if that's okay, Ira. So two quick thoughts. Platforms are really powerful. I know it sounds silly, but I mean, it's important to say. I don't know, I mean, from everything that I know with attempts of governments to influence platforms to do things, platforms usually kind of accepted that. And I don't know, at least from the top of my head, I can't recall like an instance where platforms were really pushing against what the regulator was trying to do. And it's going to be interesting to see when it happens, how it's going to happen, right? The only thing that somehow resembles this idea might be Uber, that basically created a model, Uber and other like micro traveling platforms. They created a model that is basically, that cuts against regulation of taxis, that cuts against labor laws. And right now, there is some pushback against this, and they seem to be winning, at least in a lot of places that I know So I wouldn't take out of the question the idea that platforms can push back really strong if they want to, if they have new board members that have new views about free speech, or if platforms that are not based in the EU or the US, let's say a really huge platform comes in from Malaysia or Saudi Arabia, it's going to be much more difficult to regulate them. That's one thing. Second thing, just really briefly, I think that when we try to understand how content moderation actually happens around the world, I think there is quite a big difference nowadays, right? So the way that content moderation regarding election law is implemented is different according to the different states in which these election law apply. Right, we've seen that with hate speech. Right, it's at least Facebook and Twitter. The algorithms are much more capable in identifying and removing hate speech in English and in Spanish than, for instance, in some of the languages in Myanmar, which Myanmar/Burma, which helps cause a lot of societal issues there and basically genocide in there. So we can see that even if the standards are similar, de facto, it's really difficult to apply the same standards all around the world. And that's something that's going to be interesting to look out in the future. Aya.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think the key issue really is whether the European approach ends up with tight regulation of what I call algorithmic amplification. If the answer to that is no, then I think we're back to relying on the Digital Services Act, and there might well be convergence, but it might not produce the regulatory results that we want. And I say that because, as Alexander was describing it, in terms of transparency, due diligence, risk assessments, compliance officers, strong enforcement, well, that sounds a whole lot like the GDPR. And the GDPR has been, moving towards success, but it's taken a long time. And until very recently, when it specifically targeted the heart of the business model, which is the use of profiling for advertising in some recent decisions, that's when some pain started to be felt and it really mattered. But we could be a long time getting there with the DSA, unless, on the other hand, it does end up specifically restricting or even banning algorithmic amplification. And in that case, I think we're much more likely to see resistance on the part of the platforms and fragmentation, because that goes to the heart of the business model, and they'll do everything in their power to fight that, up to and including, differentiating the services if that's necessary.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, but I have kind of one last question, which is in a way almost more academic, which is for Aniket. Which is, when you're kind of studying these platforms and the changes that they go through in an event, in a misinformation event or in a hate speech event, do we have good tools to ask ourselves questions like, which regulation is causing the change now? Is it like the company that has made a decision to regulate things differently, or is it something that is trickling down from hard law or from soft law from outside of the company? And I mean, this is almost like a measurement question, but I think it's also deeply important that for people who are engaging with the law to think about, how do we know if we're having an impact, or how do we know if the law is having any kind of impact, or if it's just a societal impact? So I kind of wanted to invite you to close us out with that.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the answer is that it's ultimately really complicated. One problem is kind of researcher access to data, right? So in this study, we had access, or someone else did a lot of the hard work of collecting and curating a lot of these tweets that we could then use for more downstream analysis. So that was really great, but that's not always the case, right? And kind of researcher access to data. A lot of it depends on how much the platforms themselves are able to or willing to kind of permit. And I think that's the kind of first order thing. And then the second question of what tools do we have available to us to actually study the effects of how various, say, laws or policies or decisions by different companies. I think it really depends. So we might have more kind of broadly, a lot of what we do in social sciences is try and figure out how we can make causal inferences from really messy and ultimately kind of observational data, right? We can't run experiments all the time on social media data, especially in some situations you might be able to, and you might be able to learn something from that. But when you're dealing with observational data, kind of having the right tools and having the right ability to actually make credible inferences can be really hard. We might have the statistical machinery, but may not have the data, or we may have the data, but don't have the right kind of statistical machinery. Sometimes the way a law is implemented, you can't really do what's called a natural experiment or kind of assume that you have that kind of traction. So it really depends, I think, study to study, researcher to researcher, what kind of resources there are, how much kind of close contact you have with the platforms themselves. I'm definitely not the expert on doing this kind of work, but I think everyone would basically agree it would be nice to see better researcher access and better, more conversations around how to use causal inference or machine learning to kind of glean more kind of academic insights from this.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us for this panel. I think there were a lot of kind of insights both about the regulation itself and kind of towards the end also how we measure its impact in any kind of way. I don't think we have any solutions kind of to offer up right now, but I hope this was interesting. And thank you for joining me.
Great, thank you so much. I will quickly wrap things up with a round of thank yous. Thank you to our moderators and panelists for your generosity of time and wealth of insights. Thank you to the other sort of groups who helped us plan the individual panels. Thank you to the Siegel Family Endowment for making this event possible, and to the attendees for coming and sort of with great questions. And finally to Eric Upsall, our Director of Communications, who actually did all of the hard work to make this day possible. Josh, did you have anything else before we wrap up?
I just wanted to thank Zeev for being our, well, I guess whatever side he's on in the Zoom feed. But I wanted to thank Zeev for moderating today. And again, thank all of our panelists and everybody who collaborated, all our collaborators on setting this up. It's been an incredibly informative day. And thanks everyone for joining us. So take care, everyone.